PTV, oberoende, piratistisk media, skapad och finansierad av tittarna.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode. I think we don't keep track of the episodes of PTV Global. I think it's episode number 4, though.
The episode formerly known as PTV EU.
Yes, exactly. But welcome, everyone. Today, as you probably can see already on the screen and today and in the title and everything, we are going to devote an episode to the Ukrainian war. That's what I've just been taught, that that's probably a better way to say it. And with us, of course, as always, we have Maja, who's not in picture, but who's here.
I'm here. Good evening.
We have Otto, as always. Nothing
Hello.
strange there. And we have First Focus. That's is that okay? Are we going to call you that?
You can call me Reese. That would be easier.
Reese.
Yeah.
So for everyone in the
How
chat,
you do?
it's perfect. So for everyone in the chat as well, then you can say Reese, and we're gonna delve into just the conflict, everything about it, the background, and so on. But I mean, first we gotta start with who are you, and all of that stuff. Like why do you know a lot about this?
We just start. Who are you? Let's start there.
Well, it's a good question. My name's Reese. I'm a filmmaker from Britain, and I worked the last about 10 years in the film industry, mostly working on like commercials, music videos, and that type of stuff. But I've always had a massive interest in politics and conflicts around the world and current events. And I followed the Ukrainian war in 2014 when it broke out. Because at the time I had Ukrainian housemates, so we kind of watched the developments together. And I just found that come 2018, 2019, I wasn't getting the information that I wanted from it. It had become a complete dark region. So I wanted to do something about that. So I just put all my film gear in my car, jumped in my car and just drove 2,000 miles to Ukraine and started the film. And it's just kind of spiraled from there. And I've made a career of being the person who knows about Ukraine.
It's quite. I mean, it's really quite amazing. I think particularly that. I think most people in the West can agree. Like it's a radio silence. You just know that there is something going on there, but it's very rarely covered or talked about or mentioned.
Those times that it gets talked about, it's usually, here's a group of Nazi men who are going down to fight in the war.
Yeah. Oh, you're completely correct. I had a massive misconception before I got there. And the biggest misconception is that I never realized how active the war still was. I was under the impression that these ceasefires, which came in 2015, were working and everything was fine and happy. But it's as soon as you get there, you realize that's not the case.
Yeah. I actually looked at the number quite a while ago. There's about as many deaths in the Ukrainian war every year as it is in the Swedish traffic.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, Sweden, the whole country?
Yeah, whole country.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it is one of the, it's up there for deadliest war zones. Absolutely. You just don't hear about it a lot. I mean, there's a few countries in the Middle East that can rival it, sure, but it's a European country that's up there. It's definitely not. It's far from over, let's just say that.
Yeah. And maybe we should, I realize one of the things we could do is probably take a look at the map of the region, just to get a little bit familiarized with what region of the world we're talking about.
And like always, this is like the biggest tradition we have in PTV. Yeah, start the stream, King.
Yeah, there we go. Now you should be able to see what I'm looking at in Discord.
If you watch Kingland stream on Discord, like we said, you don't get the 5-second delay, but you see everything he does with his mouse.
Right.
So, and Kingland never starts a stream until I tell him to.
Yeah, no,
Easier.
has to be requested.
I have actually got a map I made myself that's going to show you the conflict areas.
That's perfect.
It's on Google Maps. I'm wondering if there's a way I could share that with you. Just so our audience could see probably a bit easier with what was happening.
Yeah.
Let me just figure out if there's a way I can do that.
Look at it. It's no worries. If anybody in the chat knows very much about Google Maps and stuff like that, please, like always, write help. In the meantime, the war in Ukraine. I mean,
I think
yeah.
No. So do you have the map on your local machine, or is it like?
Yeah, well, I've got it on Google Maps.
On a link?
Yeah, I'm just trying to find the link for you.
Okay, cool. All right, get it.
Yeah, Aiden is usually a pro at this.
If I just share that to your email address, would that the one you sent? Would that work?
Yeah, you could probably just send it over Discord to my.
Yeah, just send the link to Chris.
Or in one of the chats here. There's a chat called Röstkanaldumpen.
Yeah.
Over.
Are you seriously gonna?
If you with the hashtags, you can just drop anything.
Great
text stuff
okay,
in
I'm sending that over to you now.
Okay, cool. That's perfect. Sweet.
Yeah, sweet. So you should see a little, the lines.
Yeah.
Makes it a bit easier.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely does. And obviously down here is Crimea, right? This is where...
Yeah, that's Crimea.
Crimea, yeah. Which is where not the conflict started, but at least this is what was very contested. And this is the eastern Ukraine that we're looking
absolutely.
at.
But I was under the impression that Crimea was controlled by Russian forces.
Yeah, it essentially is. So in 2014, these little green men, as we call them, which were Russian forces without any insignia, part of Russian armed forces, basically through naval landings in Crimea, overtook the whole peninsula. And it was bloodless. It was really a confusing time. But they seized Crimea from Ukraine, and then the following months they actually annexed it through their parliament and have now declared it, officially part of Russia. And this is something that the rest of the world doesn't recognize. But as far as Russia sees it, it's now their land. It's annexed into their parliament, and they've seized everything, involved in that. And as a result of that, there isn't any fighting with Crimea because Ukraine, it's got its army around it, but there's no disputed territory almost in terms of actual warfare. Now, of course, Ukrainians and the parliament feel that it belongs to them, but there's no conflict or attempt to take that back at the moment, because doing so would risk open war with Russia, the actual country, rather than Russian forces in the east.
Yeah, so there's actually really along this border, you could say no one goes out and says that this is actually Russian, but the reality is Russian is controlling it, and Ukraine or no one else really is going to do anything about it.
No, and this is one of the disparages between the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people, because the Ukrainian government and the rest of the world realistically know that Crimea is gone. It's not coming back. That's, unfairly you could say, but that's been taken by Russia, and nobody wants to risk anything. Except the people are so passionate about it, they would refuse any peace that took part of their country, and they want to see that returned. So it's kind of like a bit of a difference between the people and the government. But as it stands, I can't really see a way, as unfair and horrid as it is, that Crimea be returned to Ukraine. Because even in the 6-7 years that have passed, the differences that the whole region's undergone really, they've kind of pushed it to the point of no return.
Yeah. And I think you're raising something kind of interesting there. So, but the general feeling from the people is that it's a lot of, obviously a lot of anger, and probably some frustration and a little bit of anger with the government. We saw this in Armenia, where the people were completely furious.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. The government's trying to bring peace. The people want peace, but not under the terms which the government are, suggesting.
Yeah.
And the thing is, those are the terms that the government can suggest, because at the end of the day, they've not won a war. They're not necessarily losing it, but they're not able to demand exactly what the people want, which is a return to how things were before 2014. Unfortunately, that's just not realistic. While this, Russia is trying to push for, for more control and for more influence in Ukraine. So it's a massive point of contention between people and government at the moment, especially with Zelensky, because he came to power on the promise of ending the war, and he's finding that harder than what he originally intended it to be.
Yeah.
We do have a question from the chat. Nino asks, how does the tourism in Crimea work now when it's under Russia?
Well, that's a really good question. So it basically doesn't. Crimea has become one of the most locked down regions in the world. I tried to go there and I couldn't. People from Ukraine really struggled to go there, and this was once part of their land.
Yeah.
And it's really kind of a closed off place at the moment, and it's really difficult to get any opinion of what's happening there. I did a lot of research trying to reach out to people. I couldn't go there in person, and I found that I couldn't really trust anyone online. I couldn't prove that any of these sources were real. Yeah, and since they took over, I mean, no one's sure of the exact number, but Russia has been bussing in. It's hundreds of thousands of people. It might even be over 1 million Russian citizens, into Crimea to dilute that natural population, which is, the Ukrainians, the Crimean Tatars. They're having their kind of, their whole region being diluted by ethnic Russians. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. So if you actually were to look at opinions, the majority of them would probably favor the Kremlin, but those statistics have been altered by the in.
They seem to have learned something from the Israeli.
Yeah, well, the thing is, I mean, you look at Crimea and it was Russian back in the day. It can't be denied. It gives no excuse the tactics today now, the way they've seized it again, and the current foreign policy is absolutely atrocious. Yeah. But it was Russian once upon a time, so there's that link there between Russians and Crimea. So I don't think it takes much persuading for people to go there and reclaim what they consider to be theirs.
Yeah, I mean, it's perhaps worth to note how incredibly important this part is strategically. Military strategically, and Russia had a base there since before, right? Even they had their own base on this land since before the agreement, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So they had land bases, but it's army bases, which are the the bread and butter of what you want, really. The naval bases. The naval bases are incredibly important. They provide dominance for Russia on the Black Sea, and they had a pretty sizable flotilla there at the time of the revolution. So it's really easy to see that the initial Russian reaction to secure Crimea was to secure their navy that was based there, the Black Sea Navy. And as a result, Ukraine actually had their navy based there, the entirety of it, other than one frigate, which was on an EU goodwill mission. And Russia basically claimed all of that. They've taken the entirety of the Ukrainian Navy, other than this one frigate. So that obviously came back home a few weeks later to find its country with a new government, and it was the only ship left in the Navy. And it's quite a source of pride for Ukrainians now. You sometimes see it in port, and it's basically the last decent ship they've got left. But they are trying to, they've basically relocated to Mykolaiv and Odessa, and they are trying to rebuild that Navy.
Yeah.
But Russia just crippled the Ukrainian Navy at that point when they annexed Crimea.
That's insane. So they just took all of their ships, basically.
Pretty much, just belongs to us now. I mean, don't get me wrong, they didn't have the biggest navy to begin with. It wasn't like it probably wouldn't make a massive difference to the Russian Navy. It's one of the biggest navies in the world.
Yeah.
At the same time, it proved a really powerful point, and it's a message, isn't it, to show who the person in charge is, as they consider it.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely, and I mean, it's such a. It's worth to say, because I believe we all when this happened, to start kind of in the beginning of things and go back to that. This was really huge news, and but none of the real newspapers said what this really was, right? In a certain sense, it's some uprising. They're maybe a little bit backed by Russia. but you know, because you could probably say it was a pretty clear military operation from day one to then.
Yeah.
Probably pretty well planned out, and they essentially just took Ukraine's whole fleet away. I mean, it's war, right? It's like we talked a little bit about before. It's not something else to a certain extent here.
I think it's one of those things where, in hindsight, it's so easy to look back and say it's war, but at the time, it was confusion. If you I mean, I wasn't there myself at the time. I remember watching it from Britain, just trying to imagine the state that Ukraine was in. It had been in a state of revolution for months, and this is already a revolution that's turning police officers and members of the army against the public.
Yeah,
it wasn't a clean revolution. It was incredibly bloody. You know, I think it was just over 100 people had died in it. There was a hell of a lot of people injured. There was so much anger and land. So you've got all of this tension and then uncertainty. You know, you're overthrowing a government, but nobody knows what's coming next. And this is a country that's been part of the Soviet Union, so not necessarily used to free democracy, or there's no kind of lead for them to follow or to fall back upon. So it's got that, and I think a lot of people thought Russia would invade then. That was people were just expecting it. So they didn't know if, the people I spoke to out there, they were saying they were wanting Russia to come. Some people were hating the idea of Russia coming. It was a very mixed bag. And at the time, it was confusion because no shots were fired when Crimea was taken. It was completely bloodless. It was tense, and Ukrainians put up a good fight by trying to seal off their bases. But I don't think you could say it was war, or probably you could inside. At the time, I don't think people thought it was. It wasn't until after they realized, well, we've lost. We've lost this whole region. It's been taken from us. And now all this trouble has been stirred up in the east. And you can't refute that is complete and utter Russian interaction and at the behest of Russia. So I think it took a good few months to develop into what we are now seeing it as. But at the time it was chaos, I imagine.
Yeah, and we're obviously going to get into this because the eastern regions have been obviously the main focus of the conflict at this point, and has been for a long time. Mm-hmm. It has been for a real long time, actually. But if we go back to a little bit, stay maybe there for a little while. What happened during this revolution? I mean, what's called the revolution, and what was that? Could you remind us what sparked that, and what also sparked Russians' reaction to it, and how did this happen?
Absolutely. So it was called it's got a few names. The Revolution, the Revolution of Dignity, or Maidan, as it's most popularly known as, is essentially at the time. Ukrainian president at the time was leaning heavily towards Russia, and that wasn't going over very well with a population which is much more Europe leaning. And there was, if you remember, there was a revolution in 2005, 2006 in Ukraine over very similar things.
Yeah.
They felt the government was getting a bit too close to Russia. Ukraine was an independent state since 91 and wanted to reassert that. So there was, and it was more protests in 2005, 2006. It wasn't as bloody a thing, but there was like a bit of a stamp down on which direction they wanted Ukraine as a country to go to. And then it just seemed to have slipped back by the time we got to 2014. And, the person in charge again was Russian leaning, taking Russian money, refusing EU links, and signing trade deals and agreements that were favoring Russia. And it just seemed that the people had had enough of that. And it actually started out as student protests. So it was actually probably, obviously student protests, I'm not like belittling them, but it didn't turn into nationwide protests until a few days later. And the only reason I think it turned into that was the treatment of the students. It was, it was appalling. I'm talking live ammunition used against students. It was a really bloody affair. And that was just the spark which lit all of this anger and, injustice within the Ukrainian people. And actually, there was this on the metro, as they call it there. There was this announcement. My friend told me all the trains came to a stop, and there was an announcement, and no one ever found out who paid for it or who did it. And it just said students are being killed at in the central square. And he said everyone, this is during the commute, everyone just got off and marched there. and then from there, this few months of anarchy just began, and this was over the winter as well. So obviously, Eastern winter is very harsh.
Yeah.
And that just going, and eventually the government was just no longer sustainable, which brought in a whole new government, which was much more, pro-European, European leaning, and what was perceived as a government of the people. President Poroshenko came in then and led a brand new Ukraine and revitalized the Ukrainian army. So it was a very intense time for Ukraine, but they've kind of paid the blood price to put themselves on the map, as it were.
Yeah, because the Ukraine in many from a Russian perspective, this is motherland, right? I mean, if you look historically, this is like the breadbasket of the whole. It has such significant importance, right, to the Russians, and I imagine the Russians would never, the way they would have seen it. You get the Ukrainian people get its freedom, so to speak, right? We can finally be Ukrainians and finally join EU, be a little bit more modern. But Russia, wanted to have that sort of leaders who are fundamentally corrupt and, to a certain extent, support. It's a vassal state, more or less, of Russia.
Yeah. Absolutely, and it goes back long before any of our times here. When you look at the Soviet Union, obviously that was a collection of socialist republics, as it were. But Ukraine and Russia seem to have that bond that perhaps you never probably got with, the other states, that you definitely didn't get with, like Czech or, Hungary, where they were probably more under occupation. And I'm not saying Ukraine wasn't under occupation, because that's certainly the case, but I think Russia kind of evolved and put more interest and more kind of focus on Ukraine. They put a lot of their weaponry cities there, secret cities. They put a lot of their nukes there. I think there was a bit of a connection, and I think there's a connection between the people. Russia, probably out of all of the ex-Soviet bloc, Ukraine's probably the most special one. It's the one that's probably most familiar to Russia. So, I wouldn't imagine they'd want that to go at all. And the fact that the idea of Ukraine joining not only EU, but possibly NATO, that means that Russia's entire western border is going to be, other than Belarus, of course, is going to be surrounded by NATO countries. So Putin would do anything to stop that. Because as they see it, and I'm going to put this in quotation marks, because, if you zoom out and see the size of Russia, it couldn't possibly be true. But they see themselves as being surrounded by NATO. But, look how big Russia is. It's impossible to surround yourself by NATO.
Russia is surrounded by everything else.
Yeah, exactly. It's this Cold War mentality of us and them. If you're not with us, you're against us. And Russia certainly didn't want Ukraine to be against us. And as a result of that, it's ignited this war, which is going to stop progress in Ukraine. And stop it dead in its track from moving away. And I think what you're looking at here is what you're going to see in Belarus in, I'd say, about 5 years. We've seen over the last year the seeds of that being planted, and that's where Ukraine was in 2014. Starting to see in Belarus, the last holdout country of this, where the government is saying one thing, the people have clearly got a very different voice, and it doesn't take long until the people win. They always do in the end. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah. It's worth to say here, for all that it's worth, the actual revolution, in a way, on the basis of looking at, like we're trying to get a government that is more democratic and more in line with what we want, it seems to be a pretty successful one, in retrospect.
Yeah, well, it depends on how you look at it. If you look at it from the eyes of a Ukrainian, the majority of Ukrainians, they wanted a more favorable government. They were able to overthrow their government and then vote in what was generally considered to be fair elections. And the most recent election in Ukraine, 2019, has been considered the most fairest of all their elections. So they've taken that step towards democracy. So if you're in the eyes of that, and obviously that lines up with the West, so if you're looking at it through those eyes, perfect.
Yeah.
But if you're looking at it from Russia, or if you're looking at it from Yanukovych, the ex-president, he's been thrown up against. He had a commitment to fill, and people have turned him against him. So it really depends on how you look at it.
Yeah.
And I think that's the justification him and Russia are using to say this is an illegitimate government. And that's a word you hear a lot from Russian disinformation.
Yeah.
Illegitimate government. And they don't really believe that it's got any worth to them.
No, it's some form of American Western inception marionette leadership that was placed there.
And they've still got Yanukovych in hiding in Russia, waiting to swoop back in and take power, as if that's ever going to happen. Because Ukraine has moved away so much.
Because there has not been one but two presidential elections in Ukraine, right? You had the presidential election of 2014.
That's
and
right.
then you had a new presidential election, which was won by a am I correct to say comedian?
Yeah, absolutely right, President Zelensky.
Ex-comedian.
Yeah.
Do you feel that he is as anti-Russian as his predecessor?
I do, actually. He probably is not as violent. Like, in the 2014 election, Poroshenko built his campaign on it. I'm going to be strong towards Russia, crush Russia, death to Russia. The sentiment at the time, with all of this, Russian instigation in the country, that was incredibly popular, and it took him to victory. Zelensky had a different approach. He wanted to end the war. So he probably wasn't as hostile towards Russia in his talk, but I think in his actions, it's very fair to see that he certainly isn't a Russian supporter. He's closed down Russian-leaning broadcast channels. He's cut down a lot of Russian influence and corruption. But I think where he's struggling is to politically face Putin, because Putin's got much more political power than him. He's the one that's holding all the cards to end this war. So it's kind of sometimes comes across so that he's not standing up to him in the way that Poroshenko would. But I think at the end of the day, the results that Zelensky are getting are probably a bit more, a bit stronger, a bit more progressive. He just doesn't use the same amount of language and kind of, Slavic aggression, as I call it.
Okay. How big influence do you think that the EU and the EU's policy towards Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia would you feel is sort of the cause of the war?
That's a really good question. I wouldn't say EU is the biggest fear for. I mean, obviously they're putting a hell of a lot of money and time into Ukraine. The EU, I'm just trying to think of the number, but when I last looked, it was about 9 or 10 billion worth of loans and money straight into Ukraine to kind of develop it. So the EU is doing wonders into Ukraine, and it's definitely got its eyes on Ukraine being a member. But I don't think it's necessarily the EU that's causing this.
Do you really believe it's realistic to see the Ukraine as a member of the European Union?
I can say, by the way, this is Rene. I'm going to present him before he sells us. He often joins us on. He joins us normally on.
I was waiting for you.
We're talking Corona in specific.
Yeah,
but yeah, it's a good question.
Great.
So
nice to meet you. It's a very good question, and I can see it within our lifetimes. I just can't see it anytime soon. And this is part of Russia's strategy to create this Cold War in Ukraine that's not going anywhere, where essentially it makes it impossible for Ukraine to move forward because, due to the articles of these organizations such as NATO and EU, it's incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to join them where you've got active conflict or border, disorder, or any disputes in your country.
I would say it's totally impossible to join NATO, but I would say it's probably quite feasible to join the EU if the EU would like you. I mean, we do have a precedent here. Northern Cyprus is still under occupation by Turkey.
I didn't say it was impossible. I just said it's difficult. It adds to one of the the difficulties of it. Well, at the same time, when you want to join the EU, you've got to meet a checklist, as it was, and Ukraine's not there yet. And that checklist is, on wealth, corruption, rights for minorities, rights for LGBT people. Things. There's many different things, and I don't.
Things even some EU countries are having some trouble with currently.
I was going to say,
Go ahead, Maya.
A question I missed?
Yeah, I was going to swoop in here since NATO came up. We had something prepared. If you have this screen, Kringlan, I have the links in the Trello under interview stuff. There's the link to the tweet by Zelensky a couple of weeks ago, and to the NATO response to it. This was actually some news we meant to go through a couple of weeks ago, but had to skip due to time constraints. But we now have a guest who's very
knowledgeable,
who has actually has more to say in this, I think. So there we go.
Yeah, well,
let's go deeper into the NATO
and now
stuff.
look at the response. Ukraine will join NATO the same year Turkey joins the EU, and I would probably take that as more truth, because it's against the. I mean, okay, say if I was the perfect country, and I was, say I was Greenland, I've got everything. I'm not a massive threat. I don't have any natural enemies, and I'm in the perfect location, and everyone wants me to be part of their organization. It still takes years. You've got to be recommended. You've got to prove things. You've got to be not inspected, but you've got to, show that you're willing to change your entire military to the NATO code. And it's a massive thing to integrate militaries. And it will happen with Ukraine. It's just not going to happen anytime soon. Even if they didn't have any conflict or war in their land, it will take 10 to 15 years.
Why would Ukraine want to join NATO?
Because they don't want to have a war with Russia, which is an unfortunate reality for them. It's the same reason any Eastern country wants to join NATO, is because it provides that protection, which is the reason why.
To give you a little bit of context to the question, I have a dual citizenship. One of the citizenship is unfortunately a NATO member, something which I passionately hope to change. If I look at the debate, and I would say that we were never asked whether we wanted to join this military pact. This was done by the politicians. I think if they would have been a vote.
Which country are you from?
Czech Republic.
Okay.
If I look at the debate at the time, I would say everybody was looking at it as some kind of first step to joining the EU, which for me is like completely crazy. The EU is about free trade and building corporations and allowing people to travel, while NATO is all about making sure that Europe is sort of continues being under American dominance. And sort of...
I wouldn't put it like that. I agree with the first half of what you said. I wouldn't agree with the second. Of course, there's American influence in NATO, but I think the original tenet of NATO is to ensure that you're not going to be invaded by the USSR. That's the original point of it.
But the USSR,
at least what we could say then. I mean, and because that's what regardless of what NATO is doing, the general view in Ukraine is very positive towards NATO and also West in general at this point. Is that a fair statement?
Well, absolutely. When you've got a Russian army on your doorstep.
If we try to keep to the stuff we brought up, do you have any insight to this whole, why would Zelensky tweet this out? What has led to this? What's going on?
I think what led to this was, so there's two things that I would point towards this. One being Turkey, obviously probably the most controversial NATO member, but one of the most important. They've always spent the last decade, if not longer, kind of playing both sides, and that came to a bit of a halt when, if you remember, there was a crash with Turkish and Russian aircraft a few years ago. So Turkey's become a bit more anti-Russian, and the recent war in Azerbaijan has kind of been a Russia-Turkey proxy war too. So Turkey has really been promoting Ukraine to NATO. It wasn't that interested in it a few years ago, but in the last year and a half, it's recommending, and that's how you need to get into NATO. And Turkey is now recommending Ukraine, and Turkey is pushing Ukraine to become that NATO member. So it's a bit of a step forward there. And then the second point being in the meeting between Biden and Putin, and that was the first meeting that we saw after the G7 last week or 2 weeks ago. Ukraine joining NATO actually came up, and even though that doesn't guarantee anything, it's the first step towards something happening. It began like that when West and East Germany started to unite back in the early 90s. It was a talk of Germany's going to be in NATO. And it's the same kind of vibe that people in Ukraine are getting now. The fact that you're telling a Russian president that this is going to happen, and it still doesn't mean it's going to happen fast. But I think it gives a bit of confidence and a bit of a signal to the direction in which things are going. I think Zelensky jumped the gun with this. Like, it's obviously well ahead of its time, but it's he talks about the membership process. That process is happening. It's just going to take years, if not a decade at least.
Yeah, and we need more before Ukraine can join NATO, says Stoltenberg. And I mean, I think, from their perspective, it's hard to say. I mean, I'm not sure they want to. So far, it seems like NATO has done everything to not engage in this conflict. But that may be wrong, right? What would you say about that? Like, at least on a term of grand, like offering more of physical support, it's been pretty passive.
It hasn't sent in the panzers, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. Or what would you say has been NATO's role, and how active have they been here?
Well, I think NATO have, they put a bit of an effort into Ukraine. So they labelled Ukraine a host country, and this is even before the war, when they had eyes on it joining, and Ukraine had eyes on joining, because it foresaw the problems it's currently facing. So, but as a host country, it means you get none of the protections, but you have to put up with the NATO way of life, in a way. So, like, there was a lot of NATO meetings in Kyiv at some point. There was one, I believe, after the war broke out. I'm just trying to think if it was 2016, possibly 2017. And there was a few before that. So that means that, they're considering Ukraine worthy enough to host NATO, and the idea that you do that in like a build-up. It's like having someone around for dinner before you become their friends, I guess.
Yeah.
So I think NATO have shown that support of wanting Ukraine to be part of it. And then during the actual war, NATO hasn't done anything, because that's not the point of NATO. It's not we're going to decide what to do. It only really works if someone invokes the articles to call them to war. And that doesn't mean that the individual members of NATO have done nothing. The US has been providing a limited amount of equipment. They've just signed off on a bit of a Navy replacement that they're giving to Ukraine. And Canada especially, if you're not aware, Canada has a lot of links with Ukraine. The majority of Ukrainians who emigrate go to Canada. And Canada have had a massive role. And it's been non-combat role, but they've been training the Ukrainian forces. They've had a base there since the early war, right in the middle of Ukraine, and training people, bringing it up to a European standard, because there is a difference between how ex-Soviet countries and European American countries operate in warfare, how they lead their troops, how they train their troops, how they treat their troops. So there's just that training that's happening there. And that's been happening from a lot of NATO countries. That's coming from Britain. I saw some French people there. So it's not especially a NATO thing, but each individual member has been sending aid and help where they can. In fact, I'm just trying to think. I was going to say Sweden, but actually, from the top of my mind, I think it was Norway. I think I saw some. I don't know if they were military. They were dressed like military, but I have a feeling they're more like volunteers, and they were doing this kind of training exercise. But I wouldn't have looked them up and said they were official.
But you could say so. Individual countries have obviously been involved. I think we want to also as well kind of move over to. We've gone through a little bit of the history and a little bit of NATO's involvement and all of this stuff. But the conflict, the war, you probably, or we can talk about the terminology, obviously, is ongoing, and it's been ongoing for quite a long time. And maybe we could talk a little bit about these eastern provinces. I mean, you've been there now for quite some time, right?
That's what I want to wonder. Where have you been and how long? I mean, all we
Okay,
know is that you sat in a car and you drove to Ukraine.
Yeah, yeah, I did. I mean, I've got some photos to prove it. Like, let me tell you, driving across Europe is a pleasure. Like, and then if you scroll a bit on this map, if you find Lviv on the left of Ukraine, sorry, if you go right to the western border of Ukraine, Poland,
Oh,
and you'll find a city called right. If you keep going left on the
Left
Ukrainian-Polish
border.
border.
on the left border.
Towards Poland, yeah, on the left, to the border towards Poland.
That's
Lviv,
it. You
yeah,
see Lviv here.
Yeah,
Like
Lviv,
driving up to there was an absolute pleasure. It took me 3 days to get there from Britain. You know, very easy EU motorways,
Yeah.
very boring to be honest. Driving from there to Donbass, it took me 7 days. Like the
Wow.
road network in Ukraine is mental. It's just impossible to get any speed up, especially once you get past Kyiv in the central. If you can see the capital city,
Yeah.
it's once you get into the east, the difference is staggering. I don't know if you have this in your host countries, but in Britain we have what we call the north-south divide. The idea that the south's better developed and a bit richer, and the north's not. Ukraine has that like tenfold on a crazy level. And everything is different. The language is slightly different. The culture is slightly different. On the east, it's much more Russian leaning, or Russian influenced, I should say. And driving there was a nightmare. So yeah, it took 10 days in total to get to where I was. And then if you go all the way to Mariupol, if you can see on the coast of the Azov Sea, that's where I ended up first, and where I passed pretty much the majority of my time. But obviously, I did travel up and down the line in the Donetsk region, going up as far just past Donetsk.
Yeah.
You see Kramatorsk in the north there, which is just a bit behind the line. I'm pointing on my screen like you can see it.
Oh yeah.
I was just gonna wonder about that. I was like, do you know that we're not seeing what you're?
Yeah, of course.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I traveled up and down. I mean, I made my main base in Mariupol. That's like probably the most advanced city in the region, and then traveled up and down there as it was in my car, which survived an entire year.
Did you manage to cross into the rebel-controlled areas?
No, I didn't. I did try, but it didn't go down very well, actually. I contacted them and asked the permission to come across, and there's a few threats and threats.
They basically said no.
Time, so. Well, they said if I stepped foot into their territory, I'd face 10 years in jail. So, I didn't really fancy my chances.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did they specify which jail?
Yeah, it was actually in Lugansk. So these two territories that are separated, they've separated into two self-proclaimed republics, Donetsk People Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. It's based on the oblasts, which in Britain we would call the counties. I'm not sure what you would, if you'd have a word for it.
Land province.
I wouldn't have guessed that. But yeah, that's basically split along those county lines, as I would call it, and they've self-proclaimed themselves as republics. So there's two, and they say they're working separately. They've got separate leaders and presidents, but they're basically, in kudos together.
Yeah, and
probably very heavily influenced by Russia.
Yeah, to the tune of money, guns, and men. I mean, if you look at it, and if you look at how small a region this is in Ukraine, and the fact that there was few military bases in that area, because obviously when Ukraine was built up military-wise, it was part of the USSR, so all of its military bases were built in the West to fight against the West. If you were to look at that small region, the idea that they could hold out without any support against Ukraine, even a poor army of Ukraine, it's ridiculous to even conceive. The fact that there was hardly any munitions. There's one munitions factory in this occupied region, and the fact that that's supplying the amount of munitions and guns and weapons, and even the manpower, because so many people have lost their lives, and the idea that enough manpower is coming from these two small regions is, it's almost
highly military trained and prepared and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they seem to be very well organized. That's for sure. And yeah.
Yeah, and we were watching some firefights that are happening every night, and the average soldier can sometimes like loosen from his Kalashnikov 1,000 bullets, and it's like, well, where are these bullets coming from? There's no way they're being produced at such a rapid speed to be replaced if it wasn't for external, arms or anything like that. It just doesn't make any sense, especially to sustain such a long war.
I mean,
If you look at,
obviously
like,
they have support from Russia, right? It's not.
absolutely. If you just look at history, and if you look at World War One, the fact that when Britain blocked off, the North Sea to Germany, and they couldn't even last past like 4 years without supplies going in, and that's a massive, industrial beltland. So we're supposed to believe that this tiny region that's not particularly built up other than 2 big cities is supposed to be able to be at war and survive without any, arms or influence. It just doesn't make any sense.
And can you talk a little bit more just about the? I mean, you said you're traveling up and down here. I mean, what are the people like? First of all, that you meet here, like what's the? I mean, this got to be. I mean, it's not new anymore. Like, how are people reacting to this? Because this is a war zone, right? If I can understand, I'm supposing that. I mean, this is a hard blockade. This is This is not like a cutoff. Have they started building walls and stuff, or is it just a dig down kind of lower factious stuff, like all of that stuff?
Good question. So I'll answer the first question about the people. The most hospitable people I've ever met. I've never actually been anywhere where people are so friendly and just so glad to see me and to have the opportunity for their stories to be told. I actually struggled so much the first few months because I'm a British polite boy, and I couldn't really say no. Yeah. I struggled just to get out of people's kitchens because they were like, "Oh, you must come and eat." And I must, I don't have anything to my name, but I will give you everything.
Yeah.
It was, I was kind of paraded around as the exclusive British friend that everyone wanted to have. And, I do miss that about them. They were so lovely, the people. They've gone through such terrible times, such a hardship.
Yeah.
Living on a front line, never knowing if an invasion was happening. Everyone's lost someone or known someone who's lost someone. And yet they've got this resolute, bloody great attitude of just carrying on and being friendly and making the best of life. And I really did admire that about the people there, to be honest.
Yeah.
It was, it was brilliant. And it's needed because if you look at my map, we've got obviously the 2 red lines are the controlled areas. That's basically where I can tell you where it's starting to become heavy army presence. And the yellow line is an estimate of where the contact line is. And the contact line does vary. Sometimes it's as wide as 400 meters. Sometimes it's as close as 50 meters between these enemy trenches.
Yeah.
And what you really can't tell here, it's trench warfare in Europe. This is incredibly well dug out, incredibly well fortified and situated. It's had 6-7 years in the building.
Yeah.
Trenches stretching hundreds of miles, going through towns, going through like cities, countryside, and it's just packed with men. It's like World War I again. It's insane. It's modern trench warfare, and as you can tell, it goes all the way up there. And now the southern of the southern near Mariupol, around Donetsk, that sees the most action. It's definitely the heaviest of the areas.
You're talking around here, right?
Yeah.
No, Mariupol is at
right
at the coast.
I thought you said Donetsk.
Again, sorry.
Yeah, that's Mariupol.
I thought you.
Mariupol is on.
But these two, right, as well as up here.
Yeah, Donetsk.
Yeah, so that's Donetsk. That's I spent a bit of time up there. That probably comes under. I would say that's there's a lot of small villages. The reason I've marked that is because the map you're looking at is the most recent one I did on my video, and there was some shelling there.
Okay.
So that's a hospital that got shelled there in Marinka, and that was I don't know if you ever seen it in my videos, but the last one, this hospital got shelled. Someone who was in the hospital got killed because as a result of that. And I've been to that hospital. It's not anywhere near the front line. It's it's ridiculous. It's obviously like you can't accidentally shell it.
Yeah.
Essentially. But this is a tiny little town, Marinka. It's incredibly impoverished, as a result of this war. And they've literally got a front line running through their town center. It's insane.
Do these conflict areas intersect with any of the gas pipelines, like existing or planned ones?
Do you mean like Nord Stream with the German one, or?
Definitely not Nord Stream, but
No, I
Yeah,
was
Nord
going to say
Stream
Nord
is
Stream.
in the Baltic Sea, but
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
but
there are
there are some
works.
pipelines going through Ukraine,
Yeah,
and those are
absolutely.
always brought up in like geopolitical analysis.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. There are gasworks, and for the life of me, I'm going blank on where they're based. It's basically in the contact zone somewhere because both sides send teams to repair them. It fed Mariupol the gas as well because there was regular times where that got cut off, and these gasworks are regularly kind of like hindered. They've never had too much damage, but they always need to send an engineer team out there. And if you ever read the OSCE reports, they're always saying that these engineers go out there and they become under fire. It's it's a massive issue with the gas, but also the water and the electricity as well. All the regions around the front line are seeing kind of rolling blackouts, lack of water sometimes, and the water that does come isn't drinkable. So it's these basic amenities that you and I would take for advantage, they're just restricted to people living along these. But that's what you get living in a war zone, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I mean it's incredible to hear, and gotta recommend as well everyone to watch the videos, obviously. But I mean this is it's weird to a certain extent to see these sort of are both. What's the end goal here from Russia's perspective? Does anyone know why would they dig down? I mean, Ukraine probably obviously can't do much, but is the idea here to? Are they happy here? Is that it, or are they trying to push through?
So, do you mean the Russians or the Ukrainians?
The Russians, yeah.
Okay, so the Russian actual end goal is really quite simple because it's something that they've done several times before. They're doing it in Moldova, they're doing it in Georgia, and it's to take what a former region in which they had considerable influence and a region that is now breaking away to join more European-leaning institutions or NATO.
Yeah.
And the end goal is to stop that. And it's really as simple as that. They don't really have, as far as I'm able to tell, an interest in taking Ukraine because the repercussions, if they were to do that, would be so severe and so mighty, it would outdo any political or monetary value or gain that they would get in, taking a whole country. It just wouldn't really be worthwhile. And I think we're kind of seeing that time where, traditional war where countries are overtaking countries and annexing them on a grand scale. Obviously, we've seen Crimea annexed. I think when we're seeing that kind of thing on a grand scale, kind of lessening a bit, warfare is kind of changing to be more kind of like personal and, kind of behind the scenes. So the Russian goal, I believe, is to keep this, and they call it a frozen war, which I hate the name of because anyone who's been there can tell you it's not frozen because if people are dying on the daily, it still means it's going on. But they're trying to keep this frozen war going indefinitely just to prevent Ukraine from moving forward. It's going to really stop a Ukraine progression to an EU membership, or at least hinder it massively. And it's going to stop dead a Ukraine progression to the NATO while this is happening. So Russia's already achieved what it's looking for. It doesn't really cost it that much in terms of supplying arms and supplying people. It gets a few casualties in its unmarked army, but that's nothing compared to what it prevents to having another NATO country on its doorstep.
Yeah, I mean it's because how long has it been going on for?
So this has been happening since 2014, so it's in its 7th year now.
And it's been dug down pretty much since the first year, I would guess. Because when there was news about this,
I'd say the first year was a bit mobile. So if we look, this is the line as it was established in 2019, and it hasn't changed since then. During 2014 up to 2015, that line was probably further west than Mariupol. Because Mariupol fell under occupation actually,
No,
and then that was taken back. Yeah, that was taken back in 2015.
No, Mariupol never did, but Kramatorsk and Slovansk. So no, go north.
Sorry, you're saying Mariupol wasn't under occupation?
No. Mariupol was never outside the control of the Ukrainian army. There was some there was some demonstrations inside inside Mariupol, which resulted in civilian casualties because Ukrainian soldiers shot a few people.
Right. Well, I'm going to have to heavily dispute that. I mean, there's a lot of video footage of Mariupol when it went under occupation, the police station burning down, and I mean, it wasn't a massive number of people, but the whole city, kind of went under that. And then a few weeks later, the Ukrainian army and their BTPs coming and smashing through and breaking
what
through
would
the
be your
barricades that
definition
were
of occupation?
Well, the idea that the government that was elected and is a representative of Ukraine was no longer in control for a few weeks.
Okay. Traditionally, when you say occupation, that means that it is under control of a foreign military.
Well, if your government that you've elected and has represented the country isn't in your control, surely that means someone else is.
Well, then you would possibly say that Kiev was under occupation.
Well, I made that point earlier. That's how Russia and these eastern people see Kiev as being under occupation.
Yeah. I get that, but I usually don't 100% subscribe to their worldview. But okay, fine. There were definitely protests inside Mariupol, but I would never say that it was under a military occupation. The rebel troops, if you like, were never in control of Mariupol.
Well, they had a council who was. There wasn't a local council that was part of the Ukrainian government, as is recognized throughout Ukraine, that was in charge. They had to flee. And, they were their troops walking up and down the streets. And, the reason it's hard to pan down is because they haven't got an official army. It's kind of a ragtag band. So, I can understand that. But there was a point where people who were running that city for a short time wasn't Ukrainian based. And then, the Ukrainian army came and literally smashed through the barricades that they'd placed to stop them in their BTPs. And that video is widely available online. And that's when the Ukrainian flags, which were banned, suddenly started to come out again. So I would consider that actually, what I would consider an occupation.
At least we could say that the front line here was further at a certain time, right?
Because I mean the big battles, if you like, or the first flash of hostilities are in two cities that are to the north that are currently under Ukrainian control, and this is where we first saw these magic green not green, but these magic soldiers without insignia, which seemed to operate very very much like Russian special forces. But they were never in control of Mariupol. Yes, there were, shall we call it protesters who were in control of Mariupol?
No,
for sure.
If you've driven out the government that's in control, and then you're putting your own laws on who can fly which flag, does that not? I mean, how far do you need to go until you're deciding who's in, what means?
I think most people would subscribe to your. We understand, Rene, your point of view here, at least where how you define things. Yeah. The point is here that the line has actually been moved.
I would never say that Portland was under occupation. To give you a U.S. example.
I didn't catch that. It broke up there.
No, just so people understand the distinction. Here you have at least in the East, you have something which I would resemble as a rebel army. That means that these are people who are trained. They have military-style equipment, and they operate under military-style rules of engagement. They have very heavy weapons. Some of them have the ability to take out airliners from the sky. And then you have, I would call it protesters, rioters, if you like. That means civilian people who are still living in the vicinity, who have decided that they no longer want to support the Ukrainian or the quote-unquote elected government, and they have taken to the streets, and they have sort of, if you like, thrown out the elected power or the enforced power, and they are sort of running their own community, but they do not operate as an army. So I would say Mariupol was in the later stage, but they were never what I would call a rebel army present in Mariupol.
Well,
So what's the point of the rebel army if it's not to take control of a city? Is it just what?
Yeah, but I mean,
We're gonna
clearly,
end this discussion now. Nobody cares.
I think your point of contention here is, Renee, you seem to be thinking, seems to be thinking that this was some form of civilian uprising where most of the people living there wanted to join the Russians, but the actual army here, or rather the Russian-sponsored army that was in the eastern provinces, were actually never a part of this at all. And I think that's probably extremely heavily disputed, what you're saying there. But the point is...
My only answer, for that would be go there yourself and talk to the 600,000 people who live there, because, 9 out of 10 of them felt they were under occupation. They couldn't go out and live their normal lives. They couldn't fly a flag they wanted to fly because they were scared of retaliation from people who they didn't know, didn't represent them, and weren't from that city, but had come to that city from further east. So in their eyes, and this is the story I'm telling from them, they felt it was an occupation. But I am happy to move on to the point, to the next point, because I can see ourselves chasing our tail.
Yeah, the point is in the beginning this line was moving quite a lot, but it's been dug down now, and it was further inland mostly. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it was brief. The whole the movement and the fighting. If we were to take the line, I mean, if we were to be politically correct and not call it occupation, but where the active fighting was, that might be a better way of saying it. That would be further west of Mariupol, but it didn't stay there for long. It was only a matter of a few months, and then it was pushed to. And if you zoom in right on the coast of the Azov Sea, there's a village called Shirokina, which is where it currently is. You can see that. It pushed. So basically, the Battle of Shirokina was a massive, and Shirokina is kind of a district. It's technically separate, but they consider it as part of the county lines. That was a massive battle, and it was a very iconic one, because Shirokina, very much like Verdun in World War One, it's got everyone knows that village. It was a holiday village, a peaceful village, and to kind of that they can get. The idea of pushing people who weren't Ukrainian out of it was a massive kind of like a purpose for Ukrainians. And that battle did last for quite a few months. And as you can see, where the yellow line is now, the Ukrainian army is in control of Shirokina, but it does come under heavy shell fire. Yeah. And it's not exactly a secure village. And on that note, if you do check out my YouTube channel, I've got a documentary on there. It's about 15-20 minutes called Shirokina Swan Song, and that tells the story about the last 3 ladies who left Shirokina, because it's completely deserted now. No one can live there. It's heavily mined. It comes under shelling. No civilians are able to live there. But the last 3 ladies who left it, they have such an incredible story, and I made a little documentary about them 3. So, and the fact that they're not living their best life now in Ukraine. I will say this: Ukraine hasn't treated its internally displaced people very well at all. No, it's been very difficult if you were to leave your house with war to get anything, to get any kind of support. So yeah, I would recommend, if anyone's interested in that, to talk to them, because they can tell you exactly how it was when the war started. And they'll tell you exactly where the tanks came from. Yeah,
and I mean, I think it's so incredible to hear that, because you've been. I want to hear more about the people, really, and really tell everyone to obviously see the documentaries, right? Listen to the people here. But you're also saying, obviously, I mean, it's got to be to a certain extent, like what you were saying when you travel down here, and the general view that I believe that people understand and have, is that the Western Ukraine is very, very different from the Eastern Ukraine. These are countries that have lived where you have, it's just a completely different way of life. I mean, do they even feel like they're a part of a nation? How is that sort of feeling? Have they been more like, how is this treating them? All of this stuff got to be, I mean, completely, I mean, not just life shattering. Like, where do you turn and what do you do?
The thing is, and what I felt quite sad, I noticed 2 things when I was there, and one of them has really been amped up over the last few weeks. we're fortunate enough, I guess, the majority of us, to have lived in a country where the threat of invasion is just like negligible. You just don't consider it at all. To the point where you wouldn't even know what that feels like. You know, I'm British. I wouldn't consider France going to invade. You know, we've all been part of the EU and NATO together. I'm sure, you know, it's the same for a lot of people across Europe. But the mindset here is different. That living in fear, that you've seen what, you know, war can do to the east of your country, and the idea that invasion can happen, it takes such a big effect on your mind. It really stops you from progressing with your life.
Yeah.
I noticed this in the build-up, you know, the Russian build-up a few weeks ago on the border. So many people I know who are living in Kyiv. It's so far away from where, you know, where the war is taking place, and they've shown not as much interest in the war as I'd have liked. And they're suddenly telephoning me and they're asking, you know, is this going to happen? You know, are we going to have Russian troops coming through the city? So I would say having that aspect in your life is really, really hard. And to the second point on that is, I find it incredibly hard for the children. You know, I met a lot of, you know, the 6-7-year-olds, and all they've known is this war, and they're just growing up in an environment where they think shells falling in the background, or, you know, just hearing shells or crowding under your school desk is just normal. I think that's a, you know, a massive shame. It's not right that any child should have to grow up thinking that's part of, you know, the reality. And for me, that was the biggest effect. The adults seem to have like a life goes on. You know, the Ukrainians are quite hardy folk, but, you know, for me, seeing the children kind of suffer, it was difficult. I can't lie.
I mean, you're talking about something that I feel is so important, and kind of going back to a little bit like why Russia is doing this. We were reporting on the huge Russian internal troop movements, which they do. And I mean, this is something obviously that got to put a whole country in complete terror, right? Because you're having this. It's an extreme way of exerting influence.
Yeah.
That completely, you know, and particularly living close to this area.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head to show that they can. You know, Russia gets off on pretending or you're showing that it can do these things. You know, it wants to see a bit of the glory days. And the thing is, I'm not saying that it can't. Russia's incredibly powerful and it shouldn't be underestimated. It can invade Ukraine. It wouldn't lose. You know, it would see some resistance. Yeah. Of course, it wouldn't be a walk in the park. But without a swift Western intervention, it would take Kyiv. Yeah, it's just an unfortunate fact of the situation. So it does this thing to show that it still has the power, and to show that it is, you know, willing to do it if it felt it was needed to. And I think what people sometimes forget, I mean, there's the political side to it. You know, there's the you know, the showing that we can, but there's also the logistical side to it. Like NATO does this all the time. We've never done it on that scale, and we wouldn't do it on a neighboring country's border. I guess you could argue we kind of do it in South Korea every so often, you know, and that's not too a dissimilar thing. But organizing an army is hard work, you know, hundreds of thousands of people. Logistics of it is an absolute nightmare. So by doing it just this once, next time they need to do it, you know, they're going to cut that time in half. They're going to make sure they know what to do. These war games get played out for a reason. So there's also that logistical objective that Russia has of, you know, if it needs to put troops on the border, it needs to start invading. It's taking those first steps to be able to do that. And I think people often forget that that is also a really, you know, quite unique objective of what people or what countries should be doing when they're planning their militaries. Because I tell you, it's not easy organizing. It's not easy organizing these battalions. It's incredibly hard.
No, it's massive. And I was talking a little bit about because I find it just. I mean, it's regarding the Ukrainian side, like, and particularly the people living there. Do they want, like, obviously everyone is different here, and I don't want to make it sound like everyone is of one mind. But is there a lot? Is it like, do they want Ukraine to take it back? You said previously, is there a lot of anger? Is there, what's the general? Is there resignation to this fact now? Or?
Did you just ask?
If there's a lot of anger, you know, are they disappointed that the military doesn't do more? And also perhaps from the people, but also from the Ukrainian side politically, do they have any aspirations of ever taking it back, or is it all about kind of stopping any further movement here?
So yeah, the Ukrainian side is quite key. You know, well, actually, it's a very good question because I guess I've had mixed responses. Some people are very much diehard. Let's take it back. You know, if you gave them the option, they would run in with their little Kalashnikov and start spraying bullets until they took it back. I spoke to a few people who were saying too much time's passed. These people on the other side have had Russian influence, Russian TV, because they've banned all Ukrainian TV and influence on that side. And they're saying, how can we reconnect after this, such a long period of time? So I guess it is actually, from my experience, a bit of a mixed bag of what people want to happen. But I know that no one wants to take a step back further. So when I was there was there were 3 instances of disengagement which were happening, and the whole idea of that is all the signs, both the sides would agree to bring their armed forces back and make a distance of about a mile, and that was incredibly hard work on all three zones that were picked, because the Ukrainians just couldn't admit or allow it that Ukrainian troops would even come a mile back, because they were saying, this is Ukraine, we shouldn't retreat at all. So they don't want anyone to retreat in that sense, but I'm not sure if there's a massive, outside of the military circles, I'm not sure if there's a massive desire to push forward. Within the military circles, there is, and that's being held back by the government, definitely. But it's kind of difficult to gauge the entire move of the army, and if it's hard to know. I've often thought this: if Zelensky suddenly sat there in his office and said, let's just go for it, let's see what would happen. It'd be interesting to see how far Ukraine could get, and if Russia would join in officially, if it would take its army. And I think at this point it would, because over the last year and a half, it's been distributing Russian passports to these 2 breakaway republics. And they were very, very slow on the uptake. It started in about July 2019, and the uptake was terribly low. And then early 2020, it became kind of, you will take a passport. So now it's got to the point where I think it's just over 1 million Russian passports have been given to Ukrainian citizens. And it's a really good pretext for Russia to say, oh, these are also Russian citizens. So I think it would use that to defend.
That's called the Medvedev doctrine. So Russia basically says that if there are Russian citizens there, then we go to war.
Yeah, exactly. And they became Russian citizens a year ago. But it's that pretext which has been.
They used roughly the same policy in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, the 2 breakaway republics from Georgia.
That's, as I was saying to this German TV program earlier, who were asking me about this. It's such a good policy from Putin. It's really clever, and the West hasn't found a way to counter that yet. It's basically throw a few passports out or keep this frozen war going, and as a result, it does hold up all of these countries. It ties them up indefinitely, and the West needs to kind of think of a way to to make some allowances or to kind of move on from that. And we've been very slow moving. We don't have that yet, and as a result, Putin's reaching his aims and his goals in all of these countries. At the expense of millions of people.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of the thinking, just going back a little bit, a lot of the thinking about this war as it was started was also a war, kind of of internal political reasons, a little bit for Russia. I know that you're because if I understand correctly, I mean, you cannot even be on the Russian side here. That's not possible, and obviously
no. If this was to be a war, as how it's portrayed, of separatists against a European-leaning government, I think I could be against. I could be more leaning towards them.
Yeah.
But just when you get out there and you see the level of organization and equipment and the people facing, you can just tell that it's not. It's a Russian-backed, if not Russian-leading, army, essentially, just not in uniform. So from that result, it makes it really hard to to even be on their side, which is a shame, because I would love to spend time, as I did through the villages and towns of eastern Ukraine, just talking to the civilians, because there's there's over 1 million people living in this area, and they can't all be thinking that I would love to know, to get their general opinion, and just, then I would know for sure which way they were leaning. But I feel it's a bit up in the air at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, but also, just particularly to kind of get that. I mean, to most people, I would imagine, and you can tell me, because most people who've I've talked to and who are in wars, it's war zones. It's like you're talking about the complete threat of something. I mean, it's never over, right? To a certain extent, until it's over, and it's a terrifying experience. But also, a lot of people obviously do not. These are just two governments, right? It's something that in a lot of countries is also way beyond people. The conflict in itself is obviously not something that they tend to get that engaged in. I mean, you can get engaged in revenge, There may be strong nationalistic feelings that have been, ushered up, but generally it seems to me like a lot of people, just want their homes back, like their life back.
Yeah, I mean, that is, people want peace and quiet. That's definitely a massive aspect of it. But I would say from the majority of actual people I visited, there was this very strong. It's a very good question on whether I would consider it nationalistic or patriotic, and there's always where do you draw the line between them? But this feeling of what should be Ukraine was kind of rampant. I will be honest, and people were very adamant on what it is, and what their country should be.
Yeah. I mean,
it's difficult.
It's a very new country, and it's interesting to so many extents to hear that, because it's like, I mean, like you pointed out, right? It's a very divided country. For the standards of life and all of that. But
I mean, I wouldn't say it's a new country. I mean, Ukrainian people have been there for a hell of a long time. I mean, my history is very rusty, but is it like the county or the duchy of Muscovy, which eventually went on to found Russia, and that was originally out of Ukrainian lands. So it kind of predates Russia as we know it. It's just, in our mind, it's a new country in terms of the modern world, because they've been occupied for so long. So you are right in the sense that it is a new country in terms of the modern world, but the people and the traditions are older. They're older than Britain.
Ukraine has been an independent country is from 1992, I believe.
91. In modern times, but before that, and I'm talking, back to the medieval ages. It was
exactly. If you go back to medieval times, this land has always been part of something else. Whether this was the Mongols, who were there like 1,000 something. I mean, from the beginning you have the Kiev Rus, but the Kiev Rus are basically they are not a country. They are not a country in the way we will look at the country. They are like cities, more cities or counties ruled by princes. And they get sort of whacked by the Mongols, 10,000 11,000 something. Subotai and then this entire area is under the Mongol domination for like 300 years, and then it's you have the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth on the western side, and then you have the what you call the Principality of Muscovite, today's Russia, on the other side.
But
these powers sort of fight with each other about for this territory.
But it must have been so it's interesting to hear, because when there's obviously something deeper with Ukraine in that sense, that they have viewed this as its own kind of part, or I mean, it's not just something that plops up all of a sudden, and particularly not since you're saying
exactly.
that.
Hang
on, René.
Little relegation of history isn't completely wrong. It's actually incredibly factual. But what I think you're missing is the fact that during all of this, during the Mongol, invasion, Ukrainian culture was still there in the land. You know, Ukraine is just a country that has been there and occupied so many. They're basically in the worst position you'd want to be in the world. You know, between all these massive powers, and their history shows that they've just been shit on kind of a hell of a lot.
But you do realize that at the time of the Mongol invasion, you would not distinguish between a Russian prince and a Ukrainian prince.
No, exactly. But my argument is that Ukrainian princes go on to be Russian ones. My whole point of this is that Ukraine predates Russia. You know, the Throne of Kiev was there like 400s. You know.
Yeah, I mean, Kiev is of course the major city in the region. Moscow is the upstart.
So my argument is this culture, and this is what people are kind of trying to defend even now. And I know you're saying the whole point of this, why we brought it up, was because you said that Ukraine was a new state. I just wanted to make the point that technically it's been around since about the 400th. It's just that the culture gets lost in it. So I just felt like sorry, I didn't mean to call you out. I just wanted to reiterate.
No, I mean that's a super important point here. Like, and it's so interesting for me to hear that it's like, I mean, when we say nationalism, it tends to sound bad, and patriotism and whatever we're talking about. We were looking at the Artsakh area, you know, in depth, and all of the history, all of the meaning that is there, and a people that have almost always been there. I mean, it can be a nation without having a country in many ways, and sharing a lot of these things, and that complete, perhaps you know, obviously maybe a little bit naive. Happiness that must have been when they became their own state, and the complete dissolution when they realized they, in many ways, still was not a free state, right?
Yeah, you've nailed it on the head. You know, very.
I would say one problem you have here is that you are looking at this from a Western perspective with very little understanding of how the people in the region actually operate. And I've been traveling quite a lot there, so you have a lot of different people with a lot of different worldviews there. There are a lot of people who speak Russia as their primary language, and I would say about the other half speak Ukrainian as their primary language. There are a lot of people in Ukraine who feel this conflict is complete bullshit. I mean, complete bullshit. They don't want a war with Russia. They don't see no reason to have a war with Russia, and they feel that this has totally destroyed their lives. And then you have the other part who say that Russia is the biggest enemy.
I'm not sure that's exactly what we're talking about. I think obviously it's really important to qualify that no one is the same, but I do believe it's important to be able to see some form of national heritage, and that can be you know, through a deep history. Not everyone needs to feel that way, you know, and obviously not everyone feels the same. And you have a lot. You probably, I would guess, have a lot of different ethnicities that have come to stay here over a long time. Each one of them, perhaps, with you know, adding to their own culture.
This is definitely the melting pot in Europe. If you look at it from an ethnical perspective, you have had almost everybody has been here, including the Swedes.
Yeah.
There have been a lot of Swedish influence. If you go back in time, Kiev was actually founded by the Swedes. Well, the Swedes, the Vikings. They weren't Swedes at the time.
Or at least they were there defending. Helping out.
So Kiev is definitely and you have a lot of, if you look at how the people look, you see a lot of Nordic influences, especially around the Dnieper.
But I can understand it. I mean, and Renee, who has ties to Czechia, I'm just trying to kind of see that. I mean, this is an area that has gone through history almost incredibly amounts of pain, you know. And because I want to go back to that point, and for the first time perhaps saw a possibility of being their own nation in many ways, like just that kind of feeling, and this outcome must have, you know, like trying to understand. And obviously everyone is different, right? I don't want to try to qualify it, but it's an incredibly, it's a painful and interesting story.
But I would say, you know, Ukraine is a bit, I mean, it's too big. I wouldn't say it's too big, but it is big enough to have nationlets inside it. So people in the western part, people who once upon used to be part of Austria-Hungary, they have a very different way of living than the people in the east, who were part of Tsarist Russia. And you see that in so many ways in how they operate in their daily lives.
That's
Yeah,
what do you want to say about
that?
that?
As I said earlier, once you reach that river, you get what we would call here the north-south divide. You get that tenfold. It's a massive difference in culture, in architecture, in quality of living, and infrastructure, and in language and everything. It's massive. But I don't think I would agree that as a result of that, the majority of these people, kind of want to be
Russia.
part of Russia or consider that as their heritage.
No, and I think that's the important, kind of a part of the important point to make there. You can feel really strongly about being Ukrainian, despite, coming from a different cultural background. And it's gotta have been... but I mean, perhaps going back a little bit, and it's getting a little bit late, to be honest. But I actually do have quite a lot of more questions on this in particular. There's one thing I want to ask you that is on another matter, a little bit related to the sea. Perhaps there's been a lot of talk about the boat and about tensions as of late.
Yeah,
pretty big tensions actually in the Black Sea.
That's
What happened?
right. So are you referring to the British boat?
Yeah.
It's one of those things where there's been so many incidents you have to actually clarify now.
Yeah.
This is a regular little thing with Russia taking things. They seized 3 Ukrainian ships a couple of years ago at the Kerch Strait incident. But do you mean the more recent British ship?
Yeah, the British ship where the Russians apparently, according to news, dropped sink bombs and stuff to make sure that it didn't come closer to any of their considered territory.
Yeah. So I think what I find most interesting about this whole thing, before we go into the reasonings and everything behind it, if you look at what the Russian Defense Ministry and then the British Defense Ministry issued as statements, both of those things can't be true. And I think it's such a just a clear sign of how this war is operating on misinformation and trying to bring people over, because the misinformation machine is in overdrive. And this is just such a clear example of it. Russia saying, "Oh, we dropped bombs, to make it divert its course and to throw it that way." And the British were saying, "Well, we were turning anyway, and they dropped a bomb in the distance, but it would never have hit us because we weren't going that way." And I think unless you were there and you watched it, it's one of those things you would never know, because you're just getting 2 complete opposing sides. But the whole idea behind it and the region is actually really interesting. If you see, I did a video about 6 weeks ago on the Black Sea about what's happening with Russia.
Yeah, maybe you could go through it a little bit quick. I mean, this is an incredibly contested and important water, right?
Yeah, sorry. I
Can you mute your mic? You're making sounds.
Yeah, so basically you look at the idea, and obviously because it has annexed in its eyes Crimea, Russia thinks that the waters around there are belonging to it and it's its territorial waters. But that's not a view which is accepted by the rest of the world. And in an effort to keep, Russia in check, Britain and the US and like ships, and the British ships been there for over a year, and it's a destroyer we have, one of the most modern ones. And I've seen so many documentaries about what it's doing there, and it basically just like shows its presence by just zipping around the Black Sea. But the reason it's become a bit of a thing is because Russia's closed around Crimea, the Black Sea, to military vessels, the things it considered its territorial waters, including, if you see the city of Kerch there, where there's a little land bridge between Crimea and Russia, there's a little gap into the smaller Sea of Azov.
Yeah, here.
That's it. So that's the Kerch Strait, and that's obviously what Ukraine relies on for so much of its trade. And it used to have access to it when it controlled Crimea, and now Russia has access to it, and it's built a big bridge against it. And sometimes it blocks it off with big container ships. So all of these cities, Berdyansk, Mariupol, they don't get the trade as much as they used to have. So Russia's kind of closing off access to that, and Britain's trying to, patrol the waters. And really, I wouldn't look too much into it, because it's an accident waiting to happen. If you put 2 militaries together and they're patrolling and they're trying to, keep each other in check, they're going to do exactly that. So I'm not really beating the drums to war on that it's just one of those events. It will come and it will go, and people won't remember it in a few weeks' time. And I'm sure
I would assume that this is like 99% spin, right?
How do you mean?
It's not like the Britons are about to intervene on the Ukrainian side
No, of course
in
not.
this war. This is
of course
like
not.
this is a photo opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. Every side's claimed credit. You know, Britain's saying that, oh, they tried to scare us, but they couldn't, and Russians are saying, oh, we dropped a bomb right in their path. It's nonsense. You know, it's just one of those like things
I
that
mean,
are bound to happen.
I would assume that the chance of Russia actually using any form of effective weapons against a British vessel, even if it was sort of encroaching on its territorial waters, are pretty slim.
No, they would do it, but they'd make damn sure that they're going to miss. You know, like that. It's
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they would never actually use it effectively. They wouldn't sink a British ship.
Exactly. Now, where the danger is, this is going to happen again, while we've got these this situation in play, where we've got this British ship, and where we've got these this Russian, aircraft, because it's usually aircraft they send from Crimea. That's a regular thing with them flying incredibly close to the ship. They do this thing where they fly within like 50 meters from the ship, and just to kind of show a bit of like territorial aggression. That is going to happen again, and this could escalate if it goes wrong for either side. They push it a bit too far, and then it results in a casualty. Then you're on the road to escalation. So
I mean,
but still, I mean, obviously there's a lot of history here. Britain did once upon a time invade this place, like 150 years ago. The Crimean War is a very big thing. But I mean, I would say today that's simply not in the cards.
No one's talking about invasion. I'm talking about if there's an accidental death through like Russian negligence, or if there's a death through British negligence, then that's going to spike in tension. And by both sides playing this cavalier attitude of trying to be the bigger person, it increases the risk of this tenfold. And can you remember a few years ago when Russia and Turkey were doing this in Syria, and they were sending their aircraft against each other just as warnings, and then I think it was a Turkish, anti-air which shot down a Russian jet, which then had to, and one of them died.
Yeah, I would say that was a very different incident, because the Turkish.
No, I'm not saying it is this incident. If you'd listen, I'm saying it could lead to something like that, where it's basically a unhappy person would then lead to a casualty, which then spikes it. So out of the whole thing, that's my biggest fear of this, is that accidental or a kind of aggressiveness by a certain person could lead to.
But your example is very bad, because the Turkish Russian, I won't call it an incident. Basically, Turkey decided to shoot down a Russian jet. That's what they did, and they ambushed it.
Yeah, and nobody cares about that anymore. Like I said, Renee, this is the third time you've been taking this into some weird ass war discussion. Please, man.
We could at least. I mean, I think there's a really. I think everyone can say that this is a lot of these places are escalating, and accidents are waiting to happen.
Exactly, you're exactly correct, and that's what it takes is an accident, and before you know it, everyone wants to get involved, and it builds up, and it's this little tension pot which keeps them building and building.
Yeah.
And
what you said.
Disengagement.
Because what you said before, and I think what's important to note, and maybe one of the most important things I think to take away, and what we feel everywhere today, right, is this type of misinformation machine. And I'm not going to say, because it comes from all forms of places and for all forms of reasons, right? I mean, but this type of increased nationalist and the way that these news get reported and the way that they're used, this is how you slowly escalate a conflict to a point where if a big mistake happens, there is no way, you can't even talk with that leader. You can't even sit down and have a conversation, and they have to retaliate, or they're people like what you're talking about. One of the things that makes me really scared, and what we saw in Armenia as well. Naturally, even the people get so pissed that they will elect a leader that has nothing against escalating this into a full-scale conflict. And like you said, if Ukraine did, they probably could take a lot of these back. But that would instigate a war. I mean, Russia would hit back more officially, and that would put EU in a position, or NATO in a position, where they have to get actively involved. I mean, it's really tossing on the edge of what is doable, right?
Why do you feel? I think your point is extremely valid, because obviously that's how democracy works, right? If people have a desire to do X, they're gonna do X. And of course, if you breed a lot of hatred, and there is reason for that because of frustration, say for instance a pandemic hits, economy takes a slump, then of course more aggressive leaders might come to pass. We have seen that in the history, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like history, really, like listening to it, and you know, and I want to hear your input on that as well, like looking a little bit into the future, because these things, how can it be de-escalated, and what are you feeling like when you're out there? Is it like you know, from your own perspective?
Well, I don't know if it can be de-escalated, to be honest. Just the way that the warfare is played, it's so personal, and it's so intentional in the sense of you know, what the objectives are. It's not like either side are trying to gain ground. You know, if you were to look at the conventional idea of a war, as we look at it in history, is to gain the capital city. You know, that's generally, you know, to one country will invade another and try and overtake it. But that's not what's happening here. It's a whole different ballgame. Ukraine's trying to hold on. Russia's trying to kind of destabilize them. And we've got no side trying to push. So it brings a whole different meaning to you know, what the objective is. And it just reminds me a hell of a lot of the Georgian War. You know, that's, you know, in 2008, they went through a very similar thing, and they're still feeling the effects of that. Even though, you know, technically the war is over in the media and the eyes, and Russia took a state from Georgia, and they're still doing this border post thing where they're picking up border posts and moving them 20 yards every so often.
Yeah.
And it's just this continuation of these mind games and this kind of little tit for tat, as I would call it. It makes it very...
It's like confusion and upset for the sake of it.
Yeah.
It's like a goal in itself. We get
Exactly.
that too, like,
and it works. It's so bloody good. It's such a good tactic. And as I was saying earlier, the West can't counter that because we're just used to conventional ways. You know, we go to Iraq and we go to Afghanistan. We're going to just pump 160,000 troops in there, and jobs are good. And we don't know how to play this.
I would say that the West definitely has a very broad palette of different kinds of operations. Not
but I
only
don't
conventional
think we're very good
wars.
at countering misinformation. You know,
Did you see any weapons of mass destruction in Iraq?
There's a completely different conflict. I think, look, and we often talk about different things. That is in regards. I'm not absolutely not going to defend a lot of the stuff from either side, like in that sort of way, right? Because we are very critical of that. But I think in part of this conflict, I think it's really important to note that the key here is that this type of warfare, what you're saying, if I'm understanding you correctly, is to a certain extent new, and it's very, very hard to deal with, and the strain that it puts on the people, the nation, it kind of deadlocks the nation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as well, what was very surprising to me is the personal nature of this. So if you imagine that you were, you know, say if you're a young person, you're going to go and join the Swedish army. You know, you've had aspirations for that, and as far as you know, you're going to go, and then you might go against a terrorist group, or you might go to war against a country. You're doing that on behalf of that national army, and that's kind of how I always viewed things. And it wasn't until I got to Ukraine, and you know, I started to talk to the soldiers, and they were showing me the personal attacks that were happening to them, that Russia was able to instigate. It was so sophisticated. It was incredible. And it could be anything from like texts, you know, because they use the phone mast to track phone numbers of people who are using Wi-Fi or, you know, cellular data in the area. And then they start sending them personal texts to their phone. And then they're able to do a bit of social media digging and find pictures of their family, and then send a picture of your family to a fucking soldier. Imagine if you're in a trench and you think you're fighting for your country, and then a picture of your wife and daughter comes up, and it's like, oh yeah, we know who she is. You know, you should leave the trench. And instead of this warfare of, you know, two sides against each other, it becomes very personal. You know, it's very, very individual in a sense. And I think I've never seen anything like that before. This is a brand new, like, it's almost like cyber warfare.
Yeah.
And that, I think that just opens up a whole new world of individually picking off soldiers, which is incredible, right?
I mean, it's it's absolutely. We heard some. Sorry. Go ahead.
There's talk of troll factories. There's actually a Finnish journalist who wrote a whole book on those, and she's been. I'm pretty sure she hasn't had like a moment's peace from the trolls ever since.
Yeah, she did well to take them off.
Sorry?
She did well to take them on because, you know, you can't win against them as it stands. They're just relentless.
Yeah. There's
We have a question in the chat.
Yep.
Just as we've been streaming for almost 2 hours now, to instigate our new viewers, who are you?
Oh, hello. My name's Reese. I'm a filmmaker, a documentary filmmaker, and in 2019 I went to Ukraine. I wanted to hear more from the region. I'd been following it in the news since 2014, and it had kind of fallen off a cliff edge. So I went to Ukraine with my camera, not really knowing what to find, and then I ended up staying there for over a year filming a documentary, which is to be released within a few months, of what's happening on the Ukrainian front line. And that's how I seem to know so much about Ukraine. I made a bit of a career out of it.
That actually reminds me. We have such a great question that was meant. We're just floating away right into the meat of things. But, you know, taking a big step out here. Why should we care about Ukraine? I mean, it seems like we don't already. Our news aren't interested in this conflict. But then why should we?
It's a very good question. I don't know if it's one I can answer, to be honest. You know, I asked this question. It's actually a big part of the documentary. I asked this question to everyone because I couldn't find people in Kyiv who cared about it. So what chance has the rest of Europe got? You know, it's just one of those things. If it's not happening to me, it's you know, why should I care? But I think people should care because it's happening in the world. It isn't just, you know, why do we care about climate change if we're not personally affected? Why do we care about concentration camps in China? People, you know, should care because it's an injustice which is happening in the world. People are suffering as a result of this injustice, and it's only going to get fixed if people pay attention to it. And at the same time, you know, I don't want to pretend that I'm a big, massive anti-Russian person, but they've been doing this same shit. You know, in Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine. I feel pretty safe in Britain. They're not going to do it to me. But Christ, they could do it anywhere next. To the people in Belarus, you know, they've obviously, as a majority, spoken out against Russia with who they've elected, even if their government's not on it. But then you've got places like Latvia, Estonia. They could be next. So I feel you should care because it's one of those things where it's not a problem until it happens to you, but suddenly if it could, you know, you wish you'd cared earlier on.
My favorite poem comes in mind.
I love it. Give it a read.
First they came for. It's it's insane. And let me ask this, Maya. Your next door neighbor is pretty much Finland, and it's pretty much Russia.
Swedish as you are.
Is there any what should I say, fear of the Russian invasion in Finland? Because I know for a fact in Sweden there are some fears about it.
So, I just had all audio cut off. Like, I didn't hear the end of that.
Okay.
That's pretty suspicious timing, but can you repeat?
Yeah. In Sweden, there are some people and some media that are actually talking about the Russian invasion and stuff like that. Is there any talk going on in Finland about that? Are people worried about the Russian invasion?
I mean, it's the prospect of the Russian invasion has been the basis of our foreign policy since the Second World War. So Basically,
okay.
yes.
Okay, yeah.
We don't get much about Ukraine here, but we probably get slightly more than most of Europe, since we have this ongoing NATO debate, and it's always a bit more topical and like close for us than it is for you Swedes. And it always pops up when there's something going on with Russia, and people are definitely paying attention to what they're doing elsewhere, because those are the signs we're supposed to be reading. And yeah, I mean, we can't get rid of that land border. We can't move. So it's not an option. Like, it's the reason Finland still has mandatory conscription and like a standing more of a standing army than the rest of the Nordics, and actually most of the rest of Europe. So, and yeah, there's still one tends to say speak of Russaviha, like the hate for Russians. That's still pretty strong. Like, we have people, still have plenty of people alive who fought in the Second World War. So it's very much still here. It's very much still present.
Yeah.
And to
However,
follow up on that, you mentioned that there was talk about Finland joining NATO. How prominent are those talks? You know, is that I had never heard of that really. Is that something that's being considered?
Yeah, it keeps coming up. I'm sure it's at least as old as like the EU debate, and well, we've been a member of the EU since I think 1995. We joined. I think that's it. We joined at the same time as the Swedes, so they can probably confirm or refute this. So, I mean, we literally had like they postponed the vote about it here, so we could see what the Swedes decided first.
Wow.
That was the EU. So the NATO discussion has probably been alive at least as long. It was probably like brought up along with the EU. Like, should we just do it all at once? Since the main discourses that are against is that we shouldn't unnecessarily provoke Russia. Like, any moves towards, like further moves towards the West, so to say, are considered still by many as like provocations towards Russia, and that's how Russia frames it as well.
Wow.
And this has been like, it's always been like this. It has been like this since the Second World War. Like, throughout the Cold War, we were nominally independent, but we had basically the same guy as president for 30 years, and he stayed there on the merit of having good personal relations with the Russian rulers, I guess.
Well, it's how you and Austria, you had that in common post-war. You managed to avoid the horrors of the Cold War and the alignment because, you know, you're able to have this statement of neutrality where you're not going to join NATO, but you're not going to join both. And you're one of the few European countries that were able to, you know, you and Austria are one of the few that were able to stay neutral during it. You had the best of both worlds.
Yeah, and that's where it comes. It still comes from the strong reactions and the strong divides when it comes to NATO or no NATO. Since
I tell you taught me
there
something.
are people who have been paying attention to it for decades, like all the possible moves towards the West that we could be interpreted as taking.
Yeah, but it makes sense. Well, it's a policy that served you well for the last 70 years. So, you know, I mean, how to go wrong with it? And going back, Otto, to your question, I never heard this. That's in Sweden. There's a fear of Russian invasion. Could you elaborate
Oh yeah. I think we had like one of our top militaries went out just. I think it was just like 2 years ago or something like that, when he went out and said, "Yep, Sweden could stand for about 6 minutes if the Russian came."
7 days, I think. But yeah.
What is 7 days?
Yeah, it was. That's about as much defense. But I mean, I think that's been true for. And I mean, part of that was fueled by the Cold War. I mean, part of it was fueled by all sorts of things. But I think it's important to remember, like a lot of that has also to do with Russia's often quite expansive and wish to control their neighboring states. I mean, they have, in the same ways as Europe also has, and that US is doing. They're exerting control, and they're clearly exerting control, often in a quite violent way. At least these last years, right? And to go back to maybe why it's. If for nothing else, I feel, if not for the people there, obviously, and I gotta commend you, just going down there, being with people and listening to their stories.
Yeah,
I mean, that means a lot for people. It's so important to also feel like you can share your stories with someone who's gonna take it somewhere and share the knowledge. It's hopeless to be forgotten. But just how this war is happening and how it's escalating is important for us to know and for us to see, right? Through all of the noise and all of the other political engagements, this is something that can be looked at as something on its own and for what it is.
Absolutely. I always sum it up in a few words where I just say trench warfare in Europe. And this is what people, they think of World War One. And the horrors of that. And I remember when I went through school, we were learning about that, reading about it. And the reality is it's happening, perhaps not on the same scale, but on enough of a scale to be warranted as, ghastly. And it should be recognized as that. But whenever you see it in the media, for some reason, it's always, there's a slight skirmish or a conflict. And I don't think it ever fully represents the reality of what's happening out there.
No, and I think that's. I mean, it's just incredibly, and that's why I think it's so important. I mean, the news cycle is obviously. I mean, these things gets forgotten, and I one of the horrible things is, and I feel like that's part of what we have. We're getting used to it, right? And it's just kind of trench warfare in Europe probably isn't something we should get used to. And the escalation possibilities of a mistake, I mean, it's super worrisome, right? It really is.
Yeah. And I think as well, I mean, there's a lot of people I speak to, and a lot of people who are on my channel, they've got no idea about it. I get so many comments on my videos about, oh, I didn't even know this was happening. And that's just not their fault because they're not receiving that information from the relevant media channels. You just have to stumble across a random guy on YouTube who talks about nothing else but that. So I think that's really telling, just how how little the information about this war is getting out.
But I mean, this war hasn't been active, I mean, the definition of active is perhaps a bit fluent here, but this war has not had any major developments for the last 6-7 years.
Well, it depends what you would consider a major development. So, if you consider that to be a mass amount of people dying in the hundreds and hundreds and like exchange of territory, then yeah, you're completely correct. But
obviously it floats away.
Consider it to be the fact that there's over 1 million people living in below poverty conditions when they weren't before, the fact that daily shelling and killings are happening on both sides, then I would consider it major because that's a major thing. It's a disruption to life to over 1 million people. And I think as a result, it should be categorized up as actually a major thing, not just a little conflict, because it's bringing suffering and hardship to over 1 million people. That's my personal opinion on that. But just because, the media doesn't see any shifting, territorial lines, they consider it over. But they're not paying any attention to the civilians who've got no part in this. They don't want this to be happening, but they're the people who are dying and suffering as a result of this.
And I believe, and what I want to say that too, like part of maybe a critique against the news cycle, and why like it's so good to just go and do it. I mean, it's incredibly. I mean, that's just incredible. Is the need for reporting like that? No matter what you call yourself, is the need to go down and actually do it because the news cycle just moves on from it. But if we do not spend the time on trying to understand these conflicts, right? To go back to that, how are we going to learn to prevent the future ones? Each one of these are incredibly important.
Yeah, I think it's just one of those things. We've got so used to it as human beings now, just to kind of disregard the human nature that these wars, cost. Yeah, you could look at the Middle East. Over 1 million Iraqis dead, but we're just like, well, we kind of did what we needed to do. Saddam's gone, and it's the same here. So I don't know. I think the human mind's almost conditioned to not care, but I just want to make sure that people do know what's happening, especially when it's continuing, and we could really stop it because it's nonsense for the reason it's happening.
So what would be the best way to stop this?
Well, you could very easily draw an actual ceasefire that's going to work. You don't need to give up any territory right now. You don't need to make any long-term plans for a ceasefire. We just want both sides to look at an actual ceasefire and stick by it. And that's been happening since 2015, but it's just not happened in reality because the ceasefire hasn't stuck. There's not been a day gone by where shots haven't been fired, mortars haven't been fired, and people are dying as a result of these. So I think just getting a ceasefire is the absolute first step, and the political stuff and the conversations can happen after. But getting a ceasefire, it just needs to happen, and it needs to happen on the ground there now. And people are trying, but neither side seems to be able to stick to it.
So are you saying the EU should somehow step in and exert influence, or?
Well, the EU how the peace talks are happening. It's called the Normandy format, and that's being led by Russia, Ukraine, France, and Germany. They're the big four in this, so it's a bit of a strange combo. And they are meeting. They last met in 2019 in October or November, I think November, and they came out with 5 aims to stop the war. None of those have happened. Within 6 months, we were promised this glorious kind of ceasefire. We're gonna end it, but it's just not happened, and it's just been the same story since 2015, and that's because one side, it's very much in their interest not to stop this because they don't want any stability to the region of Ukraine.
So how would you change that? You applying more pressure from other countries? What do you think there is any way to actually do it?
No, I don't. As I said earlier, Putin's come up with this brilliant strategy that the West haven't been able to counter, and it is to cause disruption and to cause this kind of anguish and to prevent these countries from going forward. And there's no way for the West to counter it unless they want to, step up to the mark and suddenly put military options on the table. And those military options are just going to obviously cause more deaths.
Wouldn't it be more efficient if we would expand the European Union to include Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus?
Well, yeah, that would be good. But I think a lot of people put a lot of stock in the European Union. It's not the peacekeeper that...
No, it's not. But it's definitely, I would say, a very important engine.
Yeah, no, I don't belittle it.
I mean,
and just stop interrupting.
That's fine. Go.
Yeah, but
a
that's
question
a very
there.
valid question. I honestly will give that. That was a very valid question. If the EU was to expand to that, that would definitely be a massive help to it. It's something that would take a hell of a lot of time. And of course, Russia is very much like Turkey. It's got to pull its standard of living, its standard of treatment of minority groups up before it can do that. And also, the policy they've been going against, very anti-EU, I can't see them wanting to do it, if I'm completely honest.
Yeah, I mean,
if in a magical world that can happen, it would be absolutely fantastic, but I can't.
The EU is having trouble, upholding...
Russia doesn't have a chance.
Yeah, the EU is having trouble getting its current members to uphold those values they agreed to, so...
Exactly.
So yeah, and also the last I heard, the Council of Europe, or at least many of its associated organs or organizations, were having trouble because Russia and Turkey have effectively withdrawn from it, or something. And they constitute a pretty big part of, say, the entire budget. So so that doesn't really bode well for any kind of.
Well, Russia's had a very peculiar past with that because it was actually thrown out after the annexation of Crimea, but it was let back in 2019, and then it's decided we don't really need you anyway. So it's kind of like it doesn't give a lot of credibility to an organization which is swapping its members so often. Yeah, I mean, there's turbulent times in mainland Europe as it is. Like you said, a lot of the member countries are struggling to keep their commitments. Britain's just left. So I think the idea of adding more potential strife into that it's not going to go down very well.
Obviously, the EU needs to be reformed to be able to include the western part of Europe. And the reason why I'm saying this is because one of the perhaps odd effects of the Ukrainian conflict from 2014 is that the EU lifted visa restrictions on Ukrainians.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
I mean, I work in software.
Okay.
And we do a lot of outsourcing. We have outsourcing today in both Belarus and Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you, when it comes to that ease of actually asking somebody in Kiev, could you put your ass on a plane, come to Stockholm, and we can discuss this, versus putting the exactly same question to somebody living either in Belarus or in Moscow or in Russia, it's night and day. That ease of travel really helps us out when we do projects.
Yeah, I actually talked to the British Foreign Minister about getting Britain to do this. We're somehow so behind from the EU. We wanted to be slightly different, and we're still charging. I think it's about £230, and it's the time as well. The time, it takes weeks to get a visa cleared. It's ridiculous, really. I've got friends in Ukraine who want to come and visit, but it's a hardship, and that's a hell of a lot of money for people over there as well. So yeah, the EU's done very well on that, and it is that very, very first step of integration, isn't it? To bring them into the EU family. So certainly no complaints on that.
But I mean, the EU also doesn't seem to be very good. One option is economic sanctions, and the EU doesn't have a great, I guess, track record in actually getting any of those instituted. I mean, I tried to bring up the gas pipelines earlier because I think it's relevant, since I actually checked up on this quickly, and apparently Russia has announced that they are effectively withdrawing, or they won't be pursuing any further development in the Ukraine area, possibly due to the conflict. I'm not sure about the background there, but and part of the reason, and part of the rationale there, is that they are already successfully pursuing or trying to pursue some other options, such as the Nord Stream, which is also now running on rocks. So that I've been thinking that might have some implications for Ukraine as well, or other parts of Eastern Europe.
Obviously,
as Russia gets those options closed off to them, they
Ukraine makes a hell of a lot of money. Makes a hell of a lot of money on the transportation of gas through Ukraine into Europe. You're talking about billions a year, and when Nord Stream comes in, it's just going to exclude that, and that is going to affect Ukraine. It makes a hell of a lot of its budget from that. So it'd be interesting to see how it moves on from that. I honestly can't paint the picture of the future from that. I hope it manages to get subsidies from elsewhere, but it will certainly have a big effect. Russia has, as it does with all of Europe, kind of controlling hand when it comes to gas.
I think the important thing for Ukraine is to get their shit together, to start producing things, to get corruption under control. A lot of the challenges that Ukraine has, at least from the way I've seen it, it's homegrown. I mean, Ukraine could be a very rich country, but they've chosen not to. Obviously, it's always nice to have gas. I'm not saying anything against that, but yeah, Sweden doesn't, and we still manage.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is slightly different from the war, and I don't profess to be a Ukraine expert. I'm more interested in the war, because obviously I didn't even really visit much of the rest of Ukraine. But from my very brief understanding, the class system there is incredible. You're either rich or you're not, and the rich are super rich, like ridiculous. It's a system which the whole kind of communist system was exploited upon. Is everyone's equal apart from the oligarchs, which are billionaire status. And I would blame them more for holding the country back. They're the ones that are like taking the profits that should be going into tax to pay for roads, to pay for social care, to pay for bloody like anything like social care in terms of health or anything like that. You've got to pay for your own medicine. It's so backwards. And I think the people at the very top who are taking these billions to themselves are the ones to blame for that.
And I mean,
revolutions, and they still can't fix it.
No, I mean that's kind of part of the point. I suppose that's what a lot of the people were looking forward to. But if you are under that grip of, and I mean we've seen this all around the world, right? I mean, when you want to control a country, this is very effective. You have a few oligarchs that control it, and you're friends with them, and you make sure they stay in power, and you're building. And it obviously has a long kind of history here of that type of. Oligarchic governance, no matter what you call it, that functionally it becomes kind of the same. And I'm not sure how to break. I mean, that's maybe the big question. How do you break free from that sort of structures, particularly when you have?
That's out of my pay grade.
Yeah, it's not easy.
I wouldn't even know. Yeah.
And, I mean, one thing would be obviously to and what they're doing. The first step must be to get rid of Russian direct influence, right? Because it's in their direct interest to keep it that way.
Definitely. And I think one thing is to convince people that there is a better quality of life, because it's not until I was talking earlier. Sorry, was it with Renee? They didn't get EU visas until very recently. People, they're not very well traveled in Ukraine, and they find it, especially in the east, there's no belief that life gets better. They think doing this absolutely insane stuff, very, very hard way of living out there, they think that's just normal. And it's not until you try and teach them that things can be better. And if you've not got that idea of better, you're not going to fight for it because you think the whole world is living like this. And I think that's a massive part of it. And I think as things will go forward, people will kind of click and demand a bit more. But I can't see it happening anytime soon. I'm afraid there's just this acceptance that they're meant to be, not poor. People just think they're meant to be poor, and it's not that. In the West, I know we're capitalistic, and it's not always a good thing. But at least people are trying to climb a bit and better themselves.
I would definitely say that I've seen people who are working very hard in Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly. That's my point. They're working very hard and they're getting very little.
I see definitely people who are working hard and they are earning money. At least in my business, we're doing software.
Yeah, I'm talking about East Ukraine specifically. They're working hard. They're not earning money, but someone on top is.
Yeah, but I think that's pretty typical. I think it's interesting. I mean, I was traveling in China a lot and used to meet a lot of Russians, particularly who were there doing business for whatever reasons. And these were obviously successful Russians. But it's also that sort of attitude that is, so foreign to someone. When you start talking about something in the future or something greater or something better or a change, it's like it's completely hammered out. It's just like, we don't think of it. That's not, this is life. This is where I am. This is where I'm always supposed to be. And I suppose, sometimes it's also like, I don't, that's not always bad, right? But if you're going to change anything, it has to come from the people's wish and their fight to change, which they at least, in many ways have started in Ukraine. To a certain extent.
They're doing very well. They've changed a government, and God, it was bloody and it was awful. Done very well. Now they just need to know what that means. I think Ukraine needs to unite as a country. They've got massive differences between East and West. I think they need to unite and find a quality of living. And if they would be, fortunate enough to get EU membership in the next few years, that would bring it, because the EU, for all of its faults, it does roll out the cash cow, doesn't it? And it does, you look at Poland and you look at the other eastern states, it brings up a level of infrastructure and equality that really you can't argue against. And I really hope that for Ukraine, it would benefit massively from it. It really would.
And just, I think that's
There's also the issue of complication of some or even many Western ideas of progress or development not really being sustainable in the long run. So it's not really desirable to help, say, the less developed parts of Ukraine take the same path that the rest of Europe has taken in the past century or half a century or so. Like we literally, like us so-called developed countries are now, we're supposed to be figuring. Some of us are trying to figure out how to basically scale down, even, or transition to something more sustainable. And
Yeah, I get you. Countries
so,
get very bloated,
so I'm more
especially with
into like
bureaucracy.
somehow finding ways to empower these developing areas instead of, imposing or like rolling in with these promises of something that's, at least in my eyes, already of the past. Like these some ideas of progress or development that are already outdated.
Yeah, I get that. I'm a firstly like an economics person. I don't know. I'll just say myself. I think Ukraine could benefit from more money, and I think the EU would bring that. Whether that's going to change the social economics of the whole society, that's something they would have to figure out themselves. But yeah, I think you get a very different opinion in Kyiv than you would in Mariupol. There's very, very different lifestyles being lived there, very different amounts of wealth and money. It's
Yeah, I mean,
those things.
we're also stuck with the EU. Like, whether whatever we think about it, or whatever we find the faults to be, or the upsides, we don't really have an option. It's the EU is what separates us from, Ukraine in terms of geopolitics. Like the EU is what makes us different at the moment, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I mean,
I don't know.
Like,
I think you're going to have a hard time convincing a Brit that that's the fact, because
Hey, we're not all the same.
we're not the same,
No, I mean,
I mean,
we're not
I'm
all
sure you've
not all
looked at
Brits wanted to
at a
leave.
map, like ever.
Yeah,
Like
I don't know.
rock
Anyway,
in the
I
middle
didn't
of
come on this
the
program to talk about
Yeah.
Brexit. Let's talk Ukrainian war.
the tough,
but
always
you.
have to answer.
Thank you.
Like,
Always
please-
leading everything.
please let me be. Please let us use it. Like, can we as EU citizens be critical of the EU without like going full Brexit? Like,
Yeah.
that's how you get
Well-
Brexit, by not letting people be critical. Honestly.
I'll tell you what. I mean, I'm just not very versed in EU politics or Brexit or anything like that. I turn my focus to war. I like to
Yeah, I
look
get
at who's
that.
trying to kill each other, and that's probably what I'm best answering any questions about. If I'm completely honest. Couldn't tell you
Yeah,
the
I was
benefits.
mostly dunking on Renee. Sorry.
Could we do like an old man by the fire thing here? And could you tell us a story, old man? No, but
I
honestly,
really could.
I mean, I
Could
would
I
like to
visit the
story from
facilities?
where you were
I
there.
need to use the bathroom quite bad. Could I ask for
Do that.
if
Do that. You run and do
2
that.
minutes?
Kringland will take some news. I will do
Yeah,
the same.
no
as
problem.
one.
Let me figure out how to mute myself.
Yeah, no problem. Good stuff. I mean, really interesting. Chat, if you have some questions, more questions rather. I'm skipping some because they don't seem relevant at all. I'm sorry. Make sure you ask them. This is going to be the last questions. I guess Otto has asked for some form of little story. Once again, I want to tell you to go to firstfocusdocs.com, where you can find a lot of these documentaries that have already been made, and check them out if you want to learn more about this particular conflict. But I think there's also other stuff here, and hear more of the stories, because I actually also want to hear more about the people there and the situations and stuff like that. Again, like the complexities of questions gets lifted, but at the local level, it's not often that complex. I feel like at the local level, sometimes the answers can be quite straightforward. I know that I had a lot of news. I think I must have. No. We have them here. we could talk. Are we going to talk about the weather a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's really scary weather, so
Yeah, we've had a lot of weird weather now. Well, there's a lot of heat waves that we should probably talk a little bit about or mention.
Yeah.
Canada was 46.6 degrees. I think they were even higher in British Columbia.
yeah,
That's
insane. It's like so far above the average for this time of year there. Like it's insane. It's just people are like even the like meteorologists and like the professionals are just like they have no words. Like they just keep posting the pictures or like the charts, the maps of the area, just like flaming red.
yeah.
There's just no words.
Yeah, it's going into really. I actually have friends in Vancouver who are not that happy about stuff. But yeah, when it gets to these when it gets to these temperatures, it's really really dangerous. How is Finland right now? Has the rains come down a bit?
Not really. There's been a few days of slightly nicer and cooler, but we're going back up to 30-ish soon. And yeah, this isn't normal. We didn't used to have this kind of thing, like just weeks and weeks and end of 30 plus degrees. Like when we had these kinds of streaks, it was like slightly below 30, not like going above and staying there.
Mm. Yeah,
And, like, and I'm currently like up north. We're still having almost 30 degrees
yeah.
days on end.
Yeah, it's quite far, and particularly when you're having these. I think for the northern hemisphere, like where we are, that sort of hail and rain is really bad, and we're going to get into that more and more. I think particularly in the global a little bit, looking at that and looking at the possible consequences of this. That because some of them are becoming a little bit more clear now. And again, just possible consequences, but obviously food systems and so on. Welcome back.
It's been clear to people working on this for quite a while, but we literally didn't listen. Nobody listened.
No, well, I think a lot of people
It's
listen.
happening. We
Nothing is
listened.
happening.
It's
Yeah.
too late.
I was thinking, I would be super interested in that. Maybe kind of rounding it off. You know, if you have some just personal stories that you know of, or things that you want to share from the people, maybe, or from yourself, like just the messages or memories or stories or things that you found amazing through your travels.
Yeah, I mean, I the thing is, I have so many. I could probably ask you to narrow it down a bit more. Are you looking for combat-based stories, emotional-based stories? What living in the environment was like? You know, obviously, there's a big range through. You know, if you're going to be on the front line or actually part of the Ukrainian cities and towns. Have you got anything in mind?
I'm more interested in the front line,
Yeah.
but that's just me, maybe.
Okay. Yeah, I can go for that. Well, the thing is, I mean, it's a war, so you're gonna, you know, you see a lot of stuff. It's a very active. Two things I try and impress upon people. One is you know, the amount of people and the equipment and everything that's out there. It's staggering when you see it, especially with the isolation it's in, because a lot of this is just trenches that are running through the middle of the countryside, and it feels so quiet, especially if you're in Mariupol and you leave and you're going along the road and you leave the hustle and the bustle of the city. And it's just so lovely and peaceful until you get to the checkpoint, and then it's the opposite of lovely and peaceful. Desolation's a really big point. But I guess the best story I could tell you is the hidden dangers, the dangers that are there from, you know, 2015 when it's at its absolute height, that haven't really gone away. So not only are you dealing with the everyday stuff like the you know, the machine gun fire that's really sporadic, drones which are not sophisticated. They're, you know, these DJI drones, you know, the ones that anyone can just buy. You know, they tape a grenade to them and, you know, fly it into another trench. It's cheaper than sending up a proper, you know, drone. That's a pretty regular thing. And you've got RPGs, SPGs, you know, mortars. apart from all of that, you've also got to deal with the fact, especially on the Ukrainian side, that they're taking or stepping into territory that was under what they consider enemy occupation. And the dangers of that were surreal. Even, I went there 3 years after Shirokina was taken back. And to that day, they're still finding mines, they're still finding traps. It's incredible, really, to be where you're just walking and then they're like, oh shit, there's a mine here. It's, it could just pick anyone off like that. And to reiterate that, I remember I went to Bogdanivka for a disengagement, and that's a heavily mined area. And then they had this disengagement. It was a massive event. They had all the Ukrainian press there. It was the third of 3 disengagements, and it didn't happen on the first day, but by the 5th or 6th day, they made it happen. Everyone was kind of celebrating. We're going to disengage, and there was to be a demining exercise by their engineers, and they came the day after, and I went up to film them, and as we were filming them, the commander of that company stood on the mine and got his legs blown off.
Wow.
It was, it was kind of like, fuck, you're meant to be demining. I mean, he was demining, the whole thing was there, but it just shows how dangerous it is. You think the fields are mapped out, but there's not. Ukraine's got horrible, horrible mines all over the place. None of them are as mapped out as they should be. And this is going to be one of those things that really, it's going to show for the next 50 years. I can guarantee, that no one's going to pick all of them up. If the war was to end tomorrow, people are going to die in 50 years' time because of this war, because of the minefields they've laid. And I always think that it's a very good story, because it was such a jubilant time. It was such we're on a bit of a high. We've had disengagement. We've had things are getting better. There's going to be peace, and even after disengagement, for at least a few days, no one's going to shoot at each other. And then one of these threats, which is already there, just strikes and can ruin or if not kill a life. And I just remember that being a very somber, brings you down to earth moment. So I guess that's one of the stories from the front line.
Yeah. And it's quite, I mean, I had no idea that because they were there for such a short time, but still are able to lay, complete minefields over the whole area. The barricading here must be completely immense, the way that it is at the moment, but also how fast and how prepared they must have been to do exactly just this, to dig down and mine it all up.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I mean, there's several types as well. You've got your anti-personnel mine, which are the most dangerous, obviously. They're kind of under the ground. Anything or anyone could trigger them. And unfortunately, I've seen, there's a lot of stray animals around the trenches. I've seen more than one dog kind of wander into the field for a wee obliviously and not make it back.
Yeah.
But then you also get your anti-trench mines, which are they don't go off unless over 100 kilograms weighed upon them. But it's one of those things you never want to put it to the test, and they're scattered around. So yeah, mine warfare is massive. It's absolutely massive in this type of stuff, because they're what prevents another side from progressing if you've not got the necessary manpower there. So yeah, I guess that. And I guess another kind of weird aspect of it was, people always ask about, like, oh, was it dangerous? Was it, I mean, of course it was. You could talk about what was happening on the front line. But one thing I never really expected was how dangerous it could be when I'm not on the front line. If I'm just in the city and living, just trying to get some downtime, I've been in the trenches for a few days, I want to just relax.
Yeah.
And it was a very, I wouldn't say it was a dangerous city, but it had more danger than I'm used to in a European city. And there was a time I did this environmental documentary. So Mariupol is dominated by 2 factories, and they are like the biggest spewing anti-environmental factories ever. They spew so much stuff out, and so many of the citizens are against it. And it's another perfect example of Ukraine trying to better itself and rise up against these oligarchs. But this oligarch, who lives in London, by the way, he controls these 2 factories, and it's killing a lot of people. It's causing a lot of cancer. It's poisoning the ocean. And I made a documentary about that. And after that was probably the most unsafe I ever felt.
Yeah.
And this was just in the city. I had to go to the front line for a bit of respite, if you believe it.
Yeah.
because the people who are working for these factories are steel workers. You know, they're incredibly low paid, and yet they take it as a personal slight against them that, you know, I'm trying to put them out of a job, and the harassment that we got, it was surreal. It was really, you know, dangerous. So that was like a whole different thing that I never expected to come against. You know, I thought I was trying to do some good, trying to raise some awareness, but it didn't turn out like that, actually. So I think that was the most unsafe I ever actually felt after we released this documentary trying to help people.
Yeah, no, I mean it's dangerous to go against the oligarchs in general. Tends to be.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, over what period of time exactly have you filmed this documentary? Like, I was going through your channel and all that, and the last uploads were from like November 2019, I think.
Yeah, so I was out there for the whole year of 2019 to early 2020, and the environmental one and the Shirokana Swan Song one was filmed over a period of about 6 months, and then I finished them when I was out there. And you know, I edited them myself, which is probably why the editing is a bit less than what it should be. But I released them out there, just trying to gauge a bit of traction to the channel and, you know, a bit of an audience. And then during all of that, we were filming the documentary I set out to do. Because if I'm honest, I didn't set out to do those other two documentaries. They were just stories I found when I was out there that didn't really fit in with what I was you know, trying to do or looking for, but had their own unique little story. I mean, I met the last 3 ladies who left Shirokana. It was such an incredible experience, and the story they told us, it needed some kind of documentation. But the one, you know, the main documentary which I've got in the edit now, which I'm working on, like Tongue and Hammer with the editor, that's been filmed over the last like 15 months while I was out there, and we've been in the edit since, just trying to turn a year's worth of footage. I mean, I'm talking hundreds of hours worth of footage and interviews into a compelling story that a Western audience could understand in just, you know, just a nice length. So that's pretty much been where my time's at the moment. It's so yeah, that's that.
But do you upload to the YouTube channel still, or is it mostly on your website?
Yeah, I do. I try and do. Basically, I'm just trying to get it off the ground. It's got such low coverage at the moment. So this is going to be a lovely example of misinformation. I actually had a very successful YouTube channel under the same name, First Focus, and all of that. And then basically, it must have been around September, October when I was out there. We just got completely taken offline, very much like your journalist friend with the Russian bot. We just got swamped, absolutely swamped with the dislikes. And then YouTube told us we couldn't, you know, participate or be a channel anymore. It was actually really sad. So I had to restart again, and we've never recovered the numbers. You know, we've got a bit of traction, but never compared to what we had. We used to get like 60,000 views in a video. Now we push 1,000, it's lucky. So I've really, you know, got pushed back to square one. Yeah.
So sorry, when was this?
Do it. This is, well, if you look at when I started uploading on this channel, because you'll see there's a date. It must be like September, I think. September, October. There's a date on my actual YouTube where I re-upload all the videos. And, you know, it looks like I've put like 20 videos out in one day. But that's actually, if you actually go on my the actual YouTube.
Yeah, I can go to the YouTube as well. Sorry.
So yeah, that was a massive, massive setback.
Yeah, this is a recurring thing with YouTube, actually. There was just this very recent news about a channel that was documenting or archiving these testimonies from Uyghurs, I think, that got taken down, and only part of those were ever restored. And there's suspicions that there was similar, like, possibly state-backed flagging campaign that made that happen. So they're really not great about it, and this is something we as pirates actually pay attention to on the whole EU and otherwise the policy level, since there are policies that are directing platforms to do this, to say take down human rights violations, even if it's for like purposes of documenting them.
Yeah, Yeah, I think so. And I think once a YouTube video just gets a certain amount of dislikes, they don't want to know, once that dislike eclipses the likes to a point, and if it happens to all your videos, they just, they want to lose you.
Did you try to contact them?
Yeah, but I was in communication with someone. He was trying to fix it, and it was very difficult because he was assuring me he could fix it, but nothing was happening. And while I was out there, we couldn't upload anything. So it was my own decision to, create a new channel with the same name and same everything, and then just make a video telling everyone. But then I couldn't put that out. I don't think it would ever have got anywhere with YouTube. I felt like they were leading me around the garden path, if you know that expression. It was just it was just some nonsense.
Yeah. No, we've.
I tell you,
I don't see why would you creating a new channel stop them from fixing it. They could merge them if they wanted to fix it. I mean, they are completely digitalized. There's nothing they can do.
Yeah, it's really, I like to be independent. I like to not work for a news organization because I like the idea of just slipping behind any lines and taking myself off to find a story. But the idea that the powers that be can just shut you down like that it's really terrifying, if I'm honest. I mean, they could do it again right now, and then what I've been working on for the last year would just disappear. I don't know how to fix that. They seem to have the power.
And I mean, it's one thing to a certain extent if you're breaking some known rules, but quite often, I mean, we've almost had our channel shut down. I mean, we've gotten, and they'll tell us we get a content strike, and without telling us what content it is. So there's just no way of knowing what we're doing wrong. And when you ask them, you get no. I mean, we're not big enough for them to even blink, right? You have no idea.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. Unless you're pulling in a few million, they don't care. You're just gone, and that's what we felt. We were just out of there before we knew it.
Yeah.
What would happen if we were to body block Facebook's head office in Sweden, England?
We'd get escorted away by police.
Can they legally do that?
I guess so. If standing in someone's way, I think they normally do that eventually. If you're blocking.
I'm gonna look at it.
Well, if you do it, will you make a video?
Demonstrations. They're doing digital fascism. We gotta do analog demonstrations. I feel this, Kingdom. I feel this.
Okay.
We're gonna take YouTube down.
We bring fine. No, but I mean, in so many ways, YouTube is a great platform. But obviously, we talk a lot about that. But it's really beside the point. I mean, digital freedom is super important. Has never been more important than right now because it's easy to influence these few companies that are allowed to be solo on top at the moment.
Yeah.
But I mean,
they're the arbiters of everything. So if you get access to them or if you can manipulate them,
it's but good. I mean, I'm afraid we're gonna flow off way too much here. I'm gonna make sure that we link again both your YouTube, obviously. To the people in the chat, I'm gonna make sure that this follows the videos and everything else. I know it's middle in the summer, but I hope that we will rerun this. I think it's super important for everyone to hear, and this is really a kind of a timeless, unfortunately, interview. Because to be fair,
I still had something.
Let's hear it.
If it's not, So the time you spent there. Something I'm interested is in. Something that's constantly come up during this has been the way how life is really hard for the people east, and how they have there's a scarcity of basic things or things that we consider basic here. So I'm one of those people who tries to bring climate into everything. And you've been there interacting with the locals. So was there any discussion, or did it, there's always talk of the weather. So did you come across anything, or was there any kind of trend, discussions of unusual weather or unusual seasons?
It's a bit of an unfair question against Ukraine Ukrainian people in Mariupol because it's one of the most polluted cities in Europe. So they're very much on the forefront of that. I can't explain to you. You'll have to watch my documentary if you get a chance. Mariupol, City of Blue and Grey. It just shows the level of environmental disasters happening there. It's a coastal town city, and yeah, in the middle of it, it's got these slag heaps on the beach, like enormous, that trucks can drive up and down these like slag heaps from industry, from coal, from iron. It's got 2 massive iron factories that are just spewing up these clouds. You know, you get even such thing as acid rain. People are dying in this city. You know, it's a complete and utter violation of human rights. They're incredibly environmentally conscious because you can't even open your window, because if you do, you get this black soot that comes in and like litters your floor. So yeah, they were. I can't speak as Ukraine as a whole, but where I was, environmental issues, they're much more scared about that than the war. They would rather the environment be fixed because that's the thing that is killing people. So yeah, environment rules.
Yeah. Another, maybe just one thing, like, how about like prices or availability of food was, I mean, there must be other factors as well affecting that there, but
Do you mean as in
it's,
the actual price?
yeah, since like that's one of the things that
Yeah.
yeah.
No, I found the food cheap. I mean, I came from one of the most expensive cities in Europe, or if not the world, London. The food was incredibly cheap there. It's just the quality, which was different. There's some things basically because of the war, a lot of the rail has been shut down. So a lot of freight doesn't come by rail, and because the roads aren't as good as they could be to support trucks, and refrigerated trucks aren't really a massive thing. So yeah, the quality of food is, especially with fruit and veg, yeah, and they don't really use preservatives in anything. So I don't think I had a good apple or a good tomato for about a year. And in fact, to preserve things, pickle them. And if you've never had pickled tomato, I really don't suggest it. It's not the same thing. So yeah, the quality of food was difficult, but at the same time, when it was good, it was fantastic because they eat fresh. You know, sometimes they catch fresh fish. Sometimes they just kill something immediately, and then they cook the meat of it, the protein. It was really good in that sense. So it was a bit of a mixed bag.
Because
I'll tell you what was very interesting. I fell in with this priest, and his daughter spoke quite good English. He didn't speak any. He was the first Ukrainian priest, because one thing we've not covered, which I probably won't go into, but there's also a religious war happening in Ukraine with Russian Orthodox and Ukrainian Orthodox, and that's happening. That's the whole thing. And he was the first Ukrainian priest to come to Donetsk, which was to Mariupol, which is in Donetsk, which is was a massive thing in the 90s when it was a much more Russian, religious area. And anyway, I remember he'd invited me. He'd heard that I'd come, and he wanted to invite me to his house for dinner. And I remember we were driving in the car, and he said something, and his daughter heard it, and she gasped. And I was like, "Oh God, what did he say?" And I was kind of a bit panicky, thinking, God, is he going to say something like, should I be nervous? And she said, "Oh, no, my father has just asked if you're a vegetarian." And I said, "I'm not." And she went, "Well, it's not that you're not." He's like, "I've never even heard of him consider a vegetarian before." She said, "This is groundbreaking for me, to the fact that he's thinking of vegetarianism." And she said, this is he's never ever even had this thought, and the fact that he's asked you is quite special. And I actually felt quite touched, and I almost wanted to be a vegetarian just to cause that confusion in his life. But yeah, that's the general mood of eating there. It's vegetarianism doesn't exist.
And speaking of that, the food is grown locally, right? Quite a lot of it. There's all farmland around as well. Can it be used even further away, I guess?
Oh gosh, I mean, I got a lot of my food from babushkas. The word for grandmas. They literally pick it. Every garden has an allotment. They just grow it in their own. And a babushka's typical day could be, go out at 8, 9 in the morning, pick a very few tomatoes or apples or whatever the hell's ripen that day, put them in a bowl, and then sit at the end of your driveway and sell them to passers-by.
Yeah.
And everyone does that. And I just used to, go shopping by going up and down the street. I'll have your tomato, I'll have your cucumber, I'll take this from that. That was a very normal thing. That's how they make their very, very few pence, grivna.
But yeah, I
you
wanted
didn't get it fresh. It came off the tree.
I wanted to check because it's like it's similar in a lot of places in China where I traveled more, and that's one of the things to kind of a little bit remember that like if something similar would happen here, we wouldn't be able to live a day. But there is still that knowledge. Like a lot of these, there is still to a certain extent that's really great because I suppose the crisis could be a lot worse, a lot on that level too. If they were completely dependent on everything being shipped there in terms of food stuff and things like that, or just the knowledge of living on the land was lost.
Yeah, the reason I try to bring some of this up is that Ukraine is a huge producer of grain, and like there are massive like losses to the harvest there. It can affect like I guess I'm not sure where they like how much of that is exported and how much they consume themselves, but it definitely will have effects on the broader area or maybe in Europe in general if there are like big damages there.
Yeah, well, fortunately, a lot of that grain farmland is in West Ukraine. It's completely untouched by the war as it is, thank God. And actually, their grain export has risen. I think it rose. I think it was 4 or 5% last year. Their grain, the biggest grain exporters in Europe. They were the breadbasket of the Socialist Union, and now they're the breadbasket of the EU essentially. So unfortunately, that is untouched. They sell that, and they sell sunflowers by the fields full. So fortunately, farming isn't as affected as it is. It's just importing fresher food into these areas, and especially water into these. Mariupol's fine. That's got everything sorted. You can't drink the tap water, but you can get enough substitutes. It's not difficult. But in these frontline villages of Shirokina, Vodian, Granitne, you have to wait for the army truck to bring you water. And then it gets difficult because you're literally waiting to get your rations, essentially. So that's the main effect the war is having, right, on those frontline villages.
Quite, yeah. Maybe we should end on, is there something you'd like people to know, like to bring with them? That you feel maybe it's unreported, just like...
Yeah, well, I guess I would just say what I'm always kind of thumping on the channel, on my YouTube channel. It's just like it's nothing to do with you. You're living your life in Europe. You want to live your best life. Sure, you don't need to remind yourself constantly. You don't need to live this because who wouldn't. But we'll just say, keep it in mind that these are really good people. These are European people, and they're living in absolute terror, and they're living in poverty because of an aggressive neighbor. And it's an aggressive neighbor that's been allowed to do this in Moldova, do this in Georgia, do this in many countries, and then threaten other Eastern European countries. And I would just say, spare a bit of thought for them, because they're literally, jumping in trenches, living in trenches, trying to defend their homeland just so some person in Moscow can have a political opinion or a political crowd or win the next vote or gain a bit of favor. So I'd say, don't make it the main focus of your life, but it doesn't hurt you just to educate yourself, to remind yourself of what's happening. And most importantly, be wary of misinformation, because it's out there. Russian propaganda, Russian misinformation has been proven beyond doubt to have linked towards the Brexit vote to go a certain way, the nomination of Trump. They're doing their absolute best to spread uncertainty and kind of doubt into countries that we know and love. So I would really just hammer down the point that people need to be a bit more aware of what's going on and educate themselves, I guess, because this is happening in Europe and not all as friends as we should be. No,
that's absolutely true. Yeah, I think that's it. Or I've got to thank you so incredibly much as well for coming up.
Thank you for the time.
I've had a lovely time.
Patience.
It's been such a lovely conversation. I've really enjoyed it. You know, I even enjoyed counterpoints. It's nice to discuss it. It's really nice to get opposing opinions and to discuss that and to reflect on that, because that's what it's all about, right? It's putting information and viewpoints out there. That's what my whole manner of focus and my documentary is about. So yeah, this has been an incredible opportunity for me.
Yeah. And I mean, you're welcome back anytime. I really hope we can follow up, particularly because this is with you about this in particular, because this is something that you also got to be reminded about, I guess. If we're gonna make people think about it once in a while, we need to revisit it.
Yeah, and if any major happenings in the war occur, just send us a PM, or if you see us live, just jump in. We can usually switch to English in a second.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know where I am.
Great. I think though we're actually gonna shut down the channel. It's almost 12 o'clock here, late, and then for Finland it's like 1 o'clock, I guess.
Yeah.
But thank you, the viewers. Remember, obviously, to clip things, share things as you want and as you do. And we will
First Focus YouTube channel.
Yes. Make sure
that's a good one.
Make sure you go. I will link it once again. Make sure you go and follow. It's gonna we have links everywhere that we can put them later as well. But sleep tight, everyone, and we will see you again tomorrow at 7 o'clock. Right, Otto? I'm not wrong.
What day is it tomorrow?
Thursday.
Tomorrow is Thursday.
Yeah, it's 7 o'clock.
It's 1900s.
See you then.
Tomorrow. Are we doing anything tomorrow?
News. I think we're doing news, and then maybe some music making or something creative.
Yeah,
most likely. Talk to you then.
Until then, people. Oh, by the way, Kingland, have you bought the pool?
No. I can tell you more.
Lazy boy.
Yeah, I can explain later.
There's no explanation. You didn't. You said
PTV, oberoende, piratistisk media, skapad och finansierad av tittarna.
kuken ute. Nej, stoppa in den igen, Miss Midget, är du snäll.
Entering orbit, final destination, reaching the peak of a life of preparation. Stellar, static, this distortion as you control my actions in third person. Then comes the sun. Tell me who I have become. Harder for the system. Freedom can be bought, but still, don't be a victim. Work harder for the system. I'm guilty of these lies by our submission. Then gravity pulled my feet back to the ground. My world let escape, and you got yours and I've got mine.
Vi har inte i tillräcklig grad lyckats bryta det ekonomiska fåtalsväldet.
Just cause I knew there's a Jag tror att om man ska företräda hela det svenska samhället, då är det viktigt att man i första hand ställer sig på de sämre ställda gruppernas sida. Det är de som i första hand behöver samhällets stöd. Det är de som i första hand är intresserade av samhällets förändring. Och jag tror att solidaritetskänslan i det svenska samhället är och kommer att bli så stark att det går att få alla samhällsgruppers stöd.